My name is Dr. James Martin, and I've been a psychiatrist for almost 20 years. I've seen all kinds of people during my career: patients with deep traumas, criminals who showed no remorse, and those teetering on the edge of insanity. But none of that prepared me for the day I met Edward Brady. It was supposed to be a standard evaluation. Brady was set to be executed the next morning, and my job was to ensure he was mentally fit, to certify that he understood what he'd done. Normally, I wouldn't have taken the case, but Brady's regular psychiatrist, Dr. Morris, had committed suicide just 2 days prior. The state needed someone, and I was available. I didn't think much of it at first. Another criminal, another day in my office, another session of lies, manipulations, and confessions that didn't mean much. I arrived at the prison early. The guards led me through the maze of concrete hallways, their faces stern and distant. Brady was waiting in a small, dimly lit room, his wrists shackled to the table. I'd read about him, of course. He was notorious. 6 women murdered, bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The press had a field day when they caught him, painting him as some kind of monster. But to me, he was just another man. "Dr. Martin," he said when I entered, his voice unnervingly calm. His eyes, though, they were different. They didn't match the way most inmates looked at me: broken, angry, desperate. No, his gaze was steady. Too steady. "Edward," I replied, sitting down across from him, opening my notebook, trying to maintain professionalism despite the unease that crept into my mind. "Let's talk." His lips curled into the faintest smile. "I know what you're here for," he said. "You're here to make sure I'm sane enough to die. Isn't that ironic?" I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "We're just here to assess your mental state before the execution. Standard procedure." He chuckled softly, leaning forward. "I'm gonna save you some time, doctor. You see, Edward Brady died a long time ago. I've just been wearing his skin. Borrowed it, really." For a split second, I thought it was just another delusion, a defense mechanism, something to make himself feel less accountable for his crimes. But the way he said it, the confidence in his voice, it caught me off guard. I didn't respond right away. I just watched him, wondering if this was some kind of game. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to dismiss his words as a desperate attempt to play mind games. I've heard countless inmates claim they were possessed, that the devil made them do it. It's a common defense for men like Brady, people who want to shed their guilt like a snake sheds its skin. But there was something about the way he looked at me, so calm, so sure. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, that unsettled me. "You're not Edward Brady?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, scribbling a note as if that would somehow bring control back to the conversation. "Then who am I speaking to?" His eyes stayed locked on mine, unblinking. "Names don't matter where I come from, doctor, but you can call me what you like. People have been calling me Edward for a while now, so let's stick with that." I leaned back in my chair, gauging his expression, trying to decide if this was just another delusion. "All right, Edward," I said, playing along for now. "If you're not who you say you are, what's your purpose here? Why this body, these crimes?" Brady, or whoever he claimed to be, smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, the crimes were a necessity. Some fun along the way, too. But the truth is, it's always about the long game. You see, doctor, you think you're here to evaluate me, but you're wrong. I'm here for you." I felt a chill run through me, but I quickly pushed it aside. This was what men like him did. They played with your head, tried to shift the narrative to unsettle you. "This isn't about me," I said, keeping my tone professional, though it felt like I was trying to convince myself as much as him. "You're facing execution. You have one final chance to reflect on what you've done, to face it." Brady laughed, leaning forward as far as the restraints would allow. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You're wrong, doctor. By the end of today, you'll be the one facing your own sins. 3 murders, to be exact." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He settled back in his chair, as if he hadn't just said something utterly absurd. "You'll commit 3 murders today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Before this consultation ends. It's already started." His eyes glinted with something dark, something I couldn't name, and I felt the first real crack in my rational mind. I stared at him, the room suddenly feeling too small. 3 murders? Was this just part of his twisted game, a way to throw me off balance? I've dealt with psychopaths before. They lie, manipulate, tell you what they think will get under your skin. But Brady wasn't flinching, wasn't breaking eye contact. His calmness felt calculated. 3 murders? I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady, professional. Edward, what are you talking about? You'll see soon enough, he said, leaning back as if this whole thing was a casual conversation. The first one's already done. I felt something shift in my chest, unease morphing into something colder, something closer to fear. But that was ridiculous. I wasn't the one on trial here, wasn't the one whose life was about to end. He was. Explain yourself, I demanded, though my voice sounded thinner than I'd intended. Brady's eyes flickered with something dark, something that made me regret pushing him. Your mother, he said softly, his voice almost compassionate. You left her to die. You weren't there, were you? The air around me seemed to tighten. My mother. She'd passed a few years ago, after a long battle with illness. I'd been busy at work when it happened, hadn't made it to her bedside in time. But Brady couldn't have known that. He couldn't have known any of that. My throat tightened, and I fought to keep control. That's not murder, I said through clenched teeth. You're twisting things to suit your narrative. He chuckled. Call it what you want. Guilt, neglect, oversight. Doesn't matter. The result is the same, isn't it? She's dead, and part of you knows you could have saved her. That's one down. My hands were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white, and I hadn't even noticed. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was grasping at straws, but the words stuck in my throat. He was getting to me, making me doubt myself. This was what he wanted, control over the conversation, over me. I stood up, needing to break the tension, needing air. We're done for now, I said, moving toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, Brady's voice cut through the room again, steady and chilling. The second one, he said. You already know. It's just a matter of admitting it to yourself. I froze, my pulse hammered in my ears. He didn't need to elaborate. Deep down, I knew exactly what he was talking about. The abortion. I gripped the door handle, my knuckles aching, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Brady's words hung in the air, festering. He didn't know. He couldn't know. The abortion had been years ago, a decision that belonged to me and my wife. We'd agreed it wasn't the right time, that we weren't ready. It had been rational, practical. But hearing him say it, the word murder wrapped around the memory like a noose, tightened something in my chest that I thought I'd buried long ago. I turned around slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel it slipping. Brady's eyes followed my every move, dark and expectant. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just sat there like a man waiting for the inevitable. How do you know about that? My voice came out low, almost a whisper. I hadn't intended for it to sound so weak. I told you, Doctor, I'm not Edward Brady. I know things. He leaned forward slightly, his shackles clinking softly as he moved. Things you keep locked away, deep down where you think no one can reach them. I could feel my heart racing now, a slow, growing panic that I couldn't quite suppress. My training told me this was manipulation, a power play, a man desperate to break me before he met his end. But there was something too precise about his words, too intimate. I'd never shared the details of the abortion with anyone outside of my wife. Not even close friends knew. Brady was toying with me in a way that defied logic. This was a medical decision, I forced out, hearing how hollow it sounded the moment it left my mouth. It wasn't murder, it wasn't. I trailed off, my voice catching as Brady's gaze never wavered. He tilted his head, his face unreadable. You tell yourself that to sleep at night. But tell me, Doctor, do you think the life that never was cares about your reasons, about your logic, or does it see what I see? Another soul taken before its time. My hands trembled, and I shoved them into my pockets, trying to hide the shake. He was digging into the doubts I'd buried years ago, unearthing them with a precision that made me feel exposed, naked in front of him. I'd told myself it was the right choice. It was the right choice. But the weight of it, the memory of my wife's silent tears afterward, had lingered longer than I wanted to admit. You're full of shit, I said, but there was no conviction behind the words. I wanted to leave. to get out of that room. But I stayed. Something in me needed to see where this was going, even as every fiber of my being screamed to run. Brady's eyes darkened further, something like pity crossing his face. "Two down," he said softly. "One more to go." I stood there frozen as Brady's words echoed in my head. Two down, one more to go. He wasn't talking about metaphors anymore, wasn't pushing my guilt to the surface. No, this last one, I could feel it. It was something real, something tangible. I had to leave that room. I had to put distance between us, between his words and my mind. But my feet wouldn't move. My hand still gripped the door handle, cold and stiff. Brady sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, like a man who had nothing left to prove. "You know what the last one is, don't you, doctor? It's the easiest one. You're required to do it." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had gone dry, and all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. His words hung in the air between us, twisting, suffocating. I had spent my whole career priding myself on my rationality. Facts, logic, science. These were my foundations. But in that moment, standing there with Brady's stare boring into me, all of that felt like paper. Thin, fragile, easily torn apart. "I'm not responsible for your execution, Edward," I said, my voice hollow. The state doesn't pull the trigger," he interrupted, his tone mocking. "The state doesn't write its name on the dotted line, confirming that a man is ready to die. You do that. And when you do, doctor, that's murder number 3. My grip on the door tightened. I had signed dozens of death certificates in my career, always procedural, always clinical. The moment after the lethal injection, I'd walk into that room, check for vitals, and sign. Simple, routine. But now, with Brady sitting there, counting down my sins, I knew it wouldn't be routine. I would be ending it. I would be the final nail in the coffin of a man who claimed to be something more than human. And what if he was telling the truth? What if I was about to release something far worse? He could see the doubt in my eyes. I hated that he could see it. "You don't believe in souls, do you, doctor? No heaven, no hell. Just flesh and bone. I admire that about you. It's why I chose you." The room felt smaller, the air thinner. Chose me? My mind reeled. How could he possibly have chosen me? How long had he been watching, waiting for this moment? I realized then that I wasn't just another psychiatrist on another evaluation. I was part of his plan, part of something I didn't understand. My legs felt weak, but I stood my ground, refusing to let him see the fear bubbling inside me. "They're going to come for you soon," he said, his voice lowering, almost tender. "And you'll sign your name. You'll make it official. 3 murders, all tied up neat and tidy." I yanked the door open, stepping into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The guards outside gave me a quick nod, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing. I couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe right. I needed to get out of there, needed space to clear my head, to stop the chaos unraveling inside me. But as I walked down the hallway, Brady's voice followed me, not out loud, but in my mind. 3 murders, all yours. Hours later, after the execution, I walked home, my legs heavy, my thoughts drowning in the weight of everything. It was done. He was gone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still hanging over me. I rounded the corner near my apartment, seeing a homeless woman sitting against the brick wall. I reached into my pocket for some change, moving toward her without a second thought. As I approached, she turned her head, her face shadowed under the hood of her coat. "Hello, James," she said. Her voice wasn't hers, it was his. My hand froze midair. My body went cold, locked in place. The world around me blurred as I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't over. Not even close. My name is Tyler Parker. I'm a marine biologist, and if you're listening to this, it means I'm dead. I didn't start out believing it would end this way. No one ever does, right? But sometimes you dig too deep, or in my case, dive too deep, and you uncover something you shouldn't, something that was meant to stay buried in the dark. It all started on a routine expedition to the Mariana Trench. We were there to study life forms that thrive in the most extreme conditions on Earth. The trench is over 7 miles deep, a place so hostile that sunlight doesn't reach it and the pressure would crush you like a can. But that's where life gets weird. Creatures down there don't follow the rules we understand. I always thought that's what fascinated me about marine biology, the unknown, the possibility that we might discover something entirely new. And we did. But it wasn't what I expected. On the third day of the dive, we found something. A chunk of tissue, floating in the water, attached to what looked like a mass of coral. It was strange, unlike anything we'd seen before. I remember Megan, one of my research partners, pulling it into the collection chamber with that nervous excitement she always had when we found something rare. "What do you think it is?" she asked, turning to me, her eyes wide. Adam, our engineer, hovered nearby, not saying much, but I could tell he was just as intrigued. At first, I thought it was just a new species, maybe some deep-sea fish or invertebrate we hadn't cataloged yet. But the tissue didn't match anything known. The structure was wrong, almost. Artificial. We brought it back to the lab, ran the preliminary tests. DNA analysis came back inconclusive. That's when I started feeling the unease settle in. This wasn't some unknown fish or mollusk. This was something else. Something we weren't supposed to find. When we reported it to our supervisors, I expected curiosity, maybe even excitement. But instead, we were met with cold stares and sharp words. "Drop it," they said. "Forget about it. Move on to the next assignment." No explanations, no questions. Just a direct order to stop. That didn't sit right with me. Megan and Adam felt the same way, though they didn't say it out loud. We knew something was off. The way they reacted, it was like they were scared of what we'd found. I remember the sinking feeling in my gut when I realized we were being stonewalled. I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's hiding something, and this was different. There was a weight to their words, a threat buried beneath the surface. But I couldn't let it go. Not when we were this close to something groundbreaking. So we made a choice. A bad one, maybe, in hindsight. We kept going. We decided to keep going. I know now that was the point of no return, the moment everything started to unravel. Back then, it just felt like curiosity, like we were too close to something big to turn back. So we worked late nights in the lab, running tests in secret, keeping everything off the books. Megan was right there with me, as eager as I was to understand what we'd found. Adam, well, he didn't say much. He'd watch us, frowning sometimes, but he never stopped us either. The deeper we dug, the more unsettling things became. The tissue sample didn't behave like anything we'd seen before. It regenerated. Slowly at first, but it grew. Megan thought it was some kind of cellular anomaly, maybe a defense mechanism. But it wasn't just regenerating, it was adapting. We exposed it to different environments, pressure, temperature, chemicals, and it changed, becoming something else entirely. I can't explain it, not really. The cells, they weren't just alive, they were reacting, almost like they had a purpose. One night, Megan called me into the lab. It was late, the kind of late where everything outside the window feels unreal, like the world is holding its breath. I found her hunched over the microscope, eyes wide, that excitement back in her voice. "Tyler, you need to see this." I leaned in, peering through the lens, and my stomach dropped. The cells had fused into something larger. Not just regenerating, but forming a structure. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But there it was, right in front of me. Something growing, shifting, alive in a way that felt wrong. "We need to stop," Adam said from behind us, his voice low, tense. He'd been quiet for too long, and when I turned to look at him, I could see the fear in his eyes. "This isn't natural, Tyler. We don't know what we're dealing with." But I didn't want to stop. Not yet. Not when we were this close. "We've already come this far," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Megan didn't argue either, though I could tell she was shaken. None of us were willing to admit it, but there was no going back. The moment we realized we were in over our heads, it was already too late. It wasn't long after that we got the first warning. A knock at the lab door, 2 men in suits, clean-cut, polite, but with eyes that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Parker," one of them said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "We've been informed about your discovery. We'd like you to stop your work, immediately." There was no room for negotiation, no questions asked, just a demand. Megan tried to protest, said we were doing important research, but they didn't care. "This is above your pay grade," the other man said, his voice flat. "You don't want to get involved with things you don't understand." They left, but the message stayed with us. Adam wanted to pack up right then, to destroy the sample and forget any of this ever happened. But I couldn't. Something about those men, about the way they spoke, made it clear this wasn't just about science. This was something bigger, something they were hiding. And I had to know what it was. So we didn't stop. Not then. Not even when things started to go wrong. The first sign that things were spiraling out of control came 3 nights after those men visited us. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with possibilities, with questions about who they were and why they cared so much about a simple piece of marine tissue. Megan and Adam had left hours earlier, but I stayed behind, running more tests on the sample. I wanted answers. I needed answers. I was staring at the data on my screen when the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Our lab wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, and power surges weren't uncommon. But then I noticed something strange. The sample under the microscope, it was moving. Not shifting slightly, like it had been before, but pulsing, as if it had a heartbeat. I froze, watching it. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't supposed to do that. Nothing should behave like that. I leaned in closer, my hands trembling, when suddenly a loud crack echoed through the lab. The lights went out completely. The emergency generator kicked in a second later, flooding the room with a cold, fluorescent glow, but that was enough. The sample was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty dish where the tissue had been, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. There was no way it could have just vanished. I started looking around the room, my pulse quickening when I saw it, a smear, faint but unmistakable, leading toward the vent in the corner. I crouched down, heart pounding, and shined my flashlight into the vent. There, clinging to the metal grate, was the tissue, or what used to be the tissue. It wasn't a mass of cells anymore. It had changed, grown somehow, thin tendrils stretching out like it was searching for something, for me. My throat tightened, a wave of nausea hitting me as I realized what had happened. It had escaped. The thing we'd been studying, analyzing, it wasn't just a sample. It was alive, and it wanted out. I slammed the vent shut, heart racing, and tried to steady my breathing. This can't be happening, I muttered to myself, but deep down, I knew it was. The tissue wasn't just adapting, it was evolving, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I needed to call Megan, tell her what was going on, but before I could reach for my phone, I heard it. A faint tapping, like nails on metal, coming from inside the vent. I backed away, my legs shaking, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. That sound, it wasn't random, it was deliberate. Whatever was in there, it was trying to get out. I grabbed the lab door handle, threw it open, and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face, my lungs burning from the effort. I stood there, panting, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But the truth was undeniable. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I called Megan that night, told her everything. Her voice was shaky on the other end of the line, but she agreed to meet me first thing in the morning. "We need to stop this, Tyler," she said, barely holding it together. "We don't know what we're dealing with. It's not just a discovery anymore. It's dangerous." I didn't argue. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew she was right. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those tendrils stretching out from the vent, searching, creeping, like the thing was aware of its surroundings. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. I knew Megan was right. We needed to stop. But the problem was, it felt like it was already too late. We'd pushed too far, let curiosity pull us into something we weren't equipped to handle. And now, I wasn't sure how to get out of it. I got to the lab early, hoping to get a head start before Megan and Adam showed up. The building felt different, emptier somehow, and when I opened the lab door, my stomach dropped. The place had been ransacked. Papers were scattered across the floor, equipment overturned, monitors cracked. I stood there for a second, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The vent, the one where the tissue had been, was wide open, the metal grate twisted like something had forced its way out. My mind raced. Who had done this? Or what had done this? I moved through the lab, stepping over broken glass and papers, my heart pounding in my chest. The sample was gone. Everything connected to it, data, notes, even the test tubes we'd been using, wiped out. Someone had come in here, maybe last night, maybe even this morning, and erased any trace of what we'd found. But why? And how did they know? Just as I started to gather what little was left, I heard the door creak open behind me. I spun around, hands shaking, half expecting to see those men in suits again. But it was Adam, pale-faced, eyes wide with panic. "Tyler," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "They're watching us. I saw them outside my apartment last night. 2 men, standing by the car, just watching." He ran a hand through his hair, looking over his shoulder like he expected them to be right behind him. "We need to go, now." I grabbed him by the arm, trying to keep him steady. "Who? The same guys from before?" But before he could answer, Megan burst in, looking just as shaken. She didn't waste time. "We're being followed," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Someone's been tracking us, maybe for days. I don't know how they got in here, but they took everything." I could feel the walls closing in around us. Everything was unraveling too fast. We didn't just stumble onto a scientific anomaly. We dug up something much darker. Whatever this was, whatever that tissue really was, there were people willing to do anything to keep it a secret. "What do we do?" Megan asked, her voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. For the first time, I felt completely out of control, like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. "We have to get out of here," I finally said, grabbing the few remaining files that hadn't been destroyed. "We can't stay in the open. We need to figure out who's behind this, but we can't do it here. Not anymore." We left the lab, moving quickly through the halls, our eyes darting around, expecting someone to come for us at any moment. As we stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. We left the lab fast, our footsteps echoing down the hall as if the building itself was trying to swallow us. Adam kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was waiting for something, or someone, to jump out from the shadows. Megan was quiet, too quiet, like she was trying to hold it together, but was already unraveling at the edges. I didn't blame her. None of this felt real. One minute we were scientists, explorers trying to uncover the mysteries of the deep, and the next, we were fugitives. The sky was gray when we stepped outside, clouds hanging low like they were part of the weight crushing down on us. We had no plan, no destination, just the fear gnawing at the back of my mind that no matter where we went, we were already being followed. I could feel it, that invisible pressure, that creeping paranoia, like eyes on the back of my neck. "We can't just run forever," Megan finally said, breaking the silence as we piled into Adam's car. "We need to tell someone. We need help." "Who?" Adam snapped. "The people we're running from are probably the same people who control everything. They'll find us before we get a chance to say anything." His hands gripped the wheel too tight, knuckles white, as we sped out of the parking lot. He wasn't wrong. We were up against something bigger than us, bigger than we could have imagined. I replayed everything in my head, the sample, the men in suits, the destruction of the lab, and it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't about science anymore. This was about power, control, and we'd stumbled into a game we had no business playing. I looked at the files I'd managed to grab, the few scraps of evidence left. Useless now. Everything we needed was gone, buried under layers of secrets and threats. But one thing still nagged at me, the creature. It was out there, loose, growing, evolving, and no one knew. My phone buzzed, snapping me back to reality. A blocked number. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to answer it, but I knew I had to. "Hello?" My voice came out more unsteady than I wanted. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then a voice, calm, measured. "Dr. Parker, you've made a mistake. Stop running. It won't end well for you." I froze, the blood draining from my face. They'd found us already. "The thing you discovered? It's not yours to understand. It's bigger than you, bigger than your team. You'll only hurt yourselves if you keep digging." I hung up, my hand shaking as I dropped the phone onto the seat. Adam glanced over at me, eyes wide. "What is it?" "They know," I whispered. "They've been watching us the whole time." Megan looked at me, her face pale. There was no need for more words. We all knew what it meant. We weren't just running from some shadow organization anymore. We were running from the truth, a truth that would never see the light of day, not with them watching. And then, just as I was trying to figure out what to do next, it hit me. The sample. The tissue wasn't just some accident. It was designed to be found, to lure us in. We weren't the hunters, we were the prey. truth is rarely pure and never simple. That quote from Oscar Wilde has never felt truer than it does now. I've always prided myself on my ability to unravel complex cases, but nothing prepared me for what awaited with Sarah Mitchell. Her file arrived on my desk just a few days ago, a routine assessment turned nightmare. Sarah's situation was troubling from the start. A 28-year-old woman, now confined to a mental health facility, had recently been involved in a violent incident at work. She severely injured a coworker during a delusional episode, and her history of untreated mental illness only added to the case's gravity. Her diagnosis, dissociative identity disorder, was supposed to be straightforward, but the more I read, the more unsettled I became. Our first session was tense. Sarah sat across from me in a chair that seemed too small for her. Her eyes darted around the room, never settling. Her hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white, as if she were bracing against an unseen force. I introduced myself, trying to offer reassurance, but her gaze remained distant. "I've been told you might be able to help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the way she said it, almost as if she was questioning her own belief in that statement. As Sarah began to describe her hallucinations, I noticed an unsettling pattern. Her delusions were specific, disturbing scenes from her past, intertwined with personal details about me, details no stranger should know. She spoke of dreams where she wandered through a dark, empty clinic. That struck me particularly hard. I had volunteered at a psychiatric clinic during my early career, a place marred by negligence and unspoken horrors. The more Sarah spoke, the more I began to question my own memories. Could her delusions be a reflection of my unresolved past? I took meticulous notes, trying to piece together the fragments of her narrative. Each session left me feeling increasingly on edge. It wasn't just the unsettling nature of her stories, but the eerie sense that they were meant for me, that they were dragging me into her darkness. It wasn't long before I began receiving cryptic messages at my office, handwritten notes that referenced Sarah's sessions and hinted at secrets I had long buried. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content was disturbingly precise. Each message seemed to pull me deeper into a web I wasn't sure I could escape. I started to wonder if the real danger lay not in Sarah's mind, but in what lay beyond it, an orchestrated effort to manipulate and destabilize me. Every interaction with Sarah seemed to echo with a sense of impending revelation. Her descriptions, her behavior, and those haunting messages made it clear that our sessions were about more than just her diagnosis. They were a window into something far darker, something that had its roots in my own past. The tension in our sessions grew more palpable with each visit. Sarah's descriptions of her delusions were becoming increasingly elaborate and unsettlingly accurate. She spoke of seeing shadows moving in the corners of her vision, of hearing whispers that felt oddly familiar. My professional curiosity battled with an eerie sense of foreboding. Was it possible that her hallucinations were more than mere symptoms? One afternoon, Sarah described a particularly vivid dream. "I was walking down a long, empty hallway," she said, her eyes wide and unblinking. "There were doors on either side, but I couldn't open them. I could hear people talking behind them, but I couldn't make out their words. I saw your face among them." Her voice was steady, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I had spent hours in similar hallways during my time volunteering at that psychiatric clinic. The connection was too specific to ignore. "Sarah, how do you know about those hallways?" I asked, trying to mask my anxiety. "What do you think they mean?" Her response was a cryptic smile that sent chills down my spine. "They're not just dreams," she replied softly. "They're memories." Her words echoed with a certainty that felt almost accusatory. That evening, as I reviewed my notes, I noticed the cryptic messages had become more frequent. The latest one was a direct reference to an incident I had worked on years ago, an incident that had been closed but left many unanswered questions. The note read, "You thought you buried the past, but it's never truly gone." Each message was like a cold splash of water, jolting me into a realization. Someone knew my secrets. The stress of the situation was starting to take its toll. I began questioning my own memories, doubting the clarity of my recollections. Was it possible that Sarah's condition was not the only thing disturbing my reality? One night, as I tried to sleep, I found myself haunted by echoes of Sarah's words and the images she described. My own past seemed to bleed into the present, blurring the lines between my work and personal life. I needed to investigate further. I dug into Sarah's past, uncovering records from her previous psychiatric treatment. What I found was chilling: documents and incidents tied to the same clinic I had been involved with. It was as if Sarah's case was an extension of that dark chapter in my life, and I was being dragged into it once again. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear. Sarah was not just a patient. She was a link to a sinister past I had hoped to leave behind. The boundaries of my professional detachment were crumbling. I felt like a puppet, my strings being pulled by forces I couldn't fully understand. Each session with Sarah felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of uncertainty and dread. Her haunting dreams were becoming my own nightmares. The line between her reality and mine was dissolving, leaving me questioning what was real and what was a carefully orchestrated illusion. The deeper I delved into Sarah's history, the more I felt a sense of creeping dread. The threads of her past seemed to weave themselves into my own, creating a tapestry of unsettling connections. I found myself obsessing over her case, my thoughts tangled in a web of past grievances and hidden truths. One evening, after another intense session, I sat in my office going through old files. I stumbled upon a report that made my heart race. The document detailed experiments conducted at the psychiatric institution, experiments that matched the symptoms Sarah described. The same institution where I had volunteered as a student, an experience I had buried in the recesses of my mind. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Sarah's symptoms were eerily similar to the side effects reported in those experiments. My mind raced. I needed to confront Sarah directly. When I next saw her, her demeanor was unsettlingly calm. "Sarah," I said, trying to maintain my composure, "I've been reviewing some documents from your past treatment. There were experiments conducted that sound similar to what you're experiencing. Can you tell me more about your time at the institution?" Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. "You know," she said slowly, "the truth is more complex than you think. The experiments were supposed to help, but they did something else." Her voice wavered, and she looked at me as if she could see through my facade. They were trying to control minds, to manipulate us into becoming something else. I felt a cold shiver. Her words resonated with a painful clarity. I began to understand that Sarah's plight was not just a personal tragedy, but part of a larger, darker scheme. The institution's experiments had not only affected Sarah, but had also left a mark on me, a mark I hadn't fully understood until now. As I investigated further, I discovered that Sarah had been a part of a control group in these experiments. Her symptoms, her nightmares, all seemed designed to reflect the trauma inflicted by these tests. The sense of manipulation was overwhelming. I was becoming a pawn in a game orchestrated by shadowy figures from my past. The culmination of my investigation came one night when I received an anonymous package at my office. Inside was a collection of documents and photographs, images of the institution, of Sarah, and of myself. The final piece of the package was a note. "You're not the hero you think you are. The past is not done with you." I felt the walls of my world closing in. The line between my professional life and personal fears was blurring. The more I uncovered, the more I felt trapped in a psychological labyrinth of my own making. The fear that had once belonged to Sarah was now mine to bear. I was entangled in a web of past sins and present horrors, with no clear way out. The realization that Sarah was used as a tool to exact revenge against me was almost too much to bear. Her delusions and distress were all part of a scheme to force me to confront my own culpability in the institution's abuses. I was no longer just an observer. I was a central player in a nightmarish game I had thought I had left behind. The more I uncovered, the tighter the noose seemed to get. I was on edge, my mind racing as I tried to piece together the fragments of Sarah's story and my own troubled past. Each discovery seemed to pull me deeper into a nightmarish reality I had hoped to leave behind. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with Sarah, I walked the dimly lit corridors of the psychiatric facility where she had been treated. The sterile smell of disinfectant was a sharp reminder of the place's dark history. I passed by rooms with locked doors and peeling paint, feeling a growing sense of dread. The walls seemed to close in on me, as if the building itself was pressing me for answers I wasn't ready to give. Sarah had described visions of a room with mirrors, where reflections seemed to take on a life of their own. Her description was disturbingly precise, mirroring memories I had long buried. I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held secrets that had never seen the light of day. I made my way to the old archives, searching for any hint of the experimental procedures that might have been conducted. As I leafed through dusty folders, a photograph fell out, a young woman in a hospital gown looking directly into the camera with an unsettling calm. I recognized her. It was Sarah. The photograph was dated just before the start of the experiments I had helped expose years ago. The implications were chilling. Sarah had been a part of the very experiments that were meant to push human boundaries. The realization that I had unknowingly contributed to her suffering was almost too much to bear. The weight of it was suffocating. When I next saw Sarah, her demeanor had changed. She seemed to be waiting for something, her eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Reynolds," she said softly, "you're finally starting to see the truth. They wanted you to find out, to make you confront your own guilt." Her voice trembled, but there was a bitter edge to her words. "You're not as innocent as you thought." I was speechless. The realization that Sarah's suffering was part of a larger scheme to torment me was a blow I hadn't expected. My entire career, my fight against unethical practices, had been used against me. I was now a puppet in a macabre play, orchestrated by those I thought I had defeated. As I left the facility, my thoughts were a whirlwind. I was no longer just a psychiatrist dealing with a complex case. I was a man entangled in a sinister plot. The sense of control I once had was slipping away. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was falling into a trap, with no way to escape. In the quiet of my office that night, I stared at the documents spread across my desk. Each page, each detail seemed to mock my attempts to uncover the truth. The more I knew, the more isolated I felt. The horror wasn't just in Sarah's story, but in the realization that I had been complicit in something far more sinister than I ever imagined. This entire ordeal had become a cruel reflection of my own fears and failures. I was left wondering if the nightmares Sarah experienced were merely a projection of my own guilt. As I stared at my reflection in the darkened window, I was haunted by the chilling thought that perhaps the true experiment was not in controlling Sarah, but in dismantling me piece by piece. In the end, I had to confront the most terrifying truth of all, that the monsters I fought against had been manipulating me all along. The line between victim and perpetrator had blurred, leaving me questioning where the nightmare ended and reality began. The further I delved into Sarah's past, the more I felt like I was stumbling through a dark maze with no exit. Every step seemed to bring me closer to a horrifying realization, one that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I had hoped to find answers, but instead, I found myself ensnared in a web of manipulation and deceit. It was late one night when I discovered the final piece of the puzzle. I was reviewing old case files when a particularly disturbing report caught my eye. It described a series of illegal experiments conducted at the very institution where Sarah had been a patient. The experiments had aimed to control and manipulate the human mind, and Sarah's name was listed among the subjects. I was stunned. The files indicated that the experiments had been halted after a scandal broke, but it was clear that Sarah had been subjected to more than what was publicly known. I needed to confront Sarah again. I found her sitting in the same sterile room, her eyes fixed on the window, as if she were waiting for something. "I found out about the experiments," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You were a part of them, weren't you?" Her gaze shifted slowly to meet mine. There was a strange calmness in her eyes, but it was undercut by a glint of something sinister. "You're starting to understand," she said. "They wanted me to be a pawn in their game, and now you're a part of it too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though deep down I was beginning to piece together the truth. "The experiments," Sarah continued, her voice low and deliberate. "They didn't just try to control us. They wanted to break you too. You were always too close to the truth, and they used me to get to you. I was a tool to manipulate you into reliving your failures. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My entire career, my fight against unethical practices, had been twisted into a personal vendetta against me. The fear I had tried so hard to suppress surged through me. They had orchestrated a cruel game, and I had been the unwitting participant. I tried to think rationally, but my thoughts were clouded by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. I had fought so hard to expose the abuses at the institution, only to find out that my own actions had been manipulated. My integrity was called into question, and the fear of losing everything I had worked for became a palpable weight. In a final desperate attempt to regain control, I confronted the administrators of the institution. But they were ready for me. They denied everything and dismissed my claims as the delusions of a troubled mind. My attempts to expose the truth only seemed to deepen the conspiracy against me. As I left the meeting, the weight of my predicament was almost unbearable. My reflection in the window of the building was not just my own, it was the reflection of a man caught in a web of deceit, struggling to untangle the threads of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that I had been drawn into a larger scheme. My fight for justice had become a twisted game, where every step I took seemed to play into the hands of those who wanted to see me fail. As I looked at the city skyline, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The fear wasn't just about what I had discovered, but about the realization that the darkness I had been fighting against had always been lurking closer than I had ever imagined. In the end, the most disturbing truth was that my quest for justice had been used against me. The psychological terror I had experienced was a reflection of my own fears and failures. The nightmares I had fought to escape were now my reality, leaving me to grapple with the unsettling question: how much of my own sanity had been sacrificed in the quest to uncover the truth? As I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought. In the end, we are not haunted by what we see, but by what we refuse to acknowledge. The truth will set you free is often said, but what if the truth you seek is a trap set to ensnare you? I've always prided myself on keeping things under control. My schedule, my life, my emotions, everything in its place. It's the only way I've managed to keep going after what happened. It's been years, but the memories are still there, buried under layers of routine. You'd never know just by looking at me, and I prefer it that way. I'm Dr. Jane Mathis, the one people come to when they need help. They tell me their darkest secrets, their fears, but no one ever asks about mine. When I first saw John Doe on my schedule, I didn't think much of it. Another patient, another mystery to unravel. I've dealt with trauma, amnesia, dissociative disorders. This was my expertise. But when they brought him in, I hesitated. His face was disfigured, a mess of scars and surgeries barely holding together what used to be a man. His eyes, though, those eyes stared at me like they recognized me. A cold shiver ran through me before I could stop it. "Dr. Mathis, right?" His voice was raspy, strained. I nodded, trying to push away the unease building in my chest. There was nothing in his file that suggested anything unusual beyond the amnesia and the accident. But the way he looked at me, like he knew something, like he knew me, I couldn't shake it. We started the session, his story fragmented and hazy. He didn't remember much, just flashes of the accident, the lights of the car, and waking up in the hospital. I listened, taking notes, staying professional. But something wasn't right. His gaze kept drifting toward me, almost as if he was waiting for me to slip up, to say something wrong. I'm used to patients searching for answers in my expressions, but this was different. It was like he already had the answers, and I was the one playing catch-up. "Do you ever forget things?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. His voice was low, almost too casual, but there was an edge to it. I met his eyes, trying not to react. "I try not to," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "Why do you ask?" He leaned forward slightly, a shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. "Because sometimes it's not about forgetting. Sometimes it's about not wanting to remember." I felt my stomach tighten. For a second, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, though I forced myself to stay calm. It was nothing. He was just probing, testing boundaries, as many patients do. Still, His words clung to me, unsettling in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The session ended, but his eyes stayed with me long after he left. Something about this man, about John, stirred something in me I didn't want to acknowledge. Memories I had locked away began to knock at the door, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure how long I could keep them shut. I sat at my desk after John left, staring at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by. I'd never had a session leave me feeling like that. Normally, I could compartmentalize, leave whatever was said in the room behind, but this was different. His question kept replaying in my head. Do you ever forget things? It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he'd said them. Like he knew something I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over in bed, my thoughts circling back to John's disfigured face, his eyes that seemed to see too much. The memories he'd stirred up weren't new, but they felt closer now, like they were hovering just beneath the surface. I hadn't thought about the attack in years, not consciously at least. I had put it all away, locked it down so deep that even I had trouble accessing it. But now, it was like he had cracked open a door I didn't want to look through. I found myself pacing the apartment, replaying the details of our session, looking for something I might have missed. I knew patients could trigger things. Sometimes they said something that just hit too close to home, but this felt intentional. He'd asked about forgetting like he knew what I had forgotten, or maybe what I was trying to forget. By the time I got back to my office the next morning, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was overthinking it, reading too much into his words. I had to be. I needed to approach this case like I did every other one, with distance, professionalism. But when I opened the door to my office, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first. Everything was where it should be. My bookshelves were neat, my desk was clear, yet there was an odd feeling like someone had been in the room when I wasn't there. I walked around, checking things. The framed photo on my desk, a picture of my mother and me when I was a child, was slightly crooked. I hadn't touched it in weeks. I straightened it and told myself it was nothing, that maybe the cleaning staff had bumped it. But as I sat down to prepare for the day's sessions, a chill crept up my spine. It got worse during our next session. John sat across from me, that same unsettling gaze fixed on me like he was waiting for something. I asked him how he was feeling, what memories had come back to him, if any. He just smiled faintly, like he was amused by the whole thing. You know, sometimes when people try so hard to forget, they end up burying things that matter, he said. What do you mean by that? I asked, trying to keep my tone even, but the way he looked at me made my hands feel cold. I think you know, he said quietly, leaning forward just a little. How long have you been running from it, Jane? My heart skipped, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I hadn't told him my first name. Not once. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I'd slipped, if I'd somehow mentioned my name to him before. But I knew I hadn't. I was always careful about maintaining boundaries, especially with patients. I hadn't told him. There was no way. How do you know my name? I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was like he enjoyed watching me squirm. You're the one who's supposed to know everything, aren't you, Dr. Mathis? His voice was casual, like we were discussing the weather. Maybe you told me and forgot, or maybe. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those dark, unreadable eyes. Maybe I've always known. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to stay composed, but I could feel my control slipping. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I forced myself to keep the session going, to ask the usual questions, but I could barely focus. His answers didn't matter anymore. All I could think about was how he knew things he shouldn't know, how every word he spoke seemed to pull me deeper into something I wasn't prepared to confront. At the end of the session, I told him we'd continue next week. He stood up slowly, looking at me like he had the upper hand. You can run from it as long as you want, he said, his voice soft but full of certainty. But it's going to catch up to you. You know that, right? I didn't respond. I couldn't. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving me alone with the growing dread that had been building inside me since I first met him. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't really left, like some part of him lingered, watching me, waiting. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake it off, telling myself that it was all in my head. I was letting this get to me more than it should. But when I got home that night, something was off. The front door wasn't locked. I always lock the door. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob, my pulse quickening. Maybe I had just forgotten in my rush this morning, but the thought didn't sit right. I stepped inside, scanning the room. Everything seemed in its place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked over to the kitchen table, where I kept a few personal items, keys, my wallet, a framed photo of me and my mother. The frame was turned, just slightly, facing the wrong direction. I stood there, staring at the photo. The shift was small, almost insignificant, but I hadn't touched that frame in days. I was meticulous about everything in my apartment, always had been. It was part of how I stayed in control. So why was it moved? My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I'd bumped it and didn't notice. Maybe the cleaning staff had knocked it over. But as I stood there frozen, I knew none of that felt right. I reached for the frame, slowly turning it back into place, my fingers brushing the cool glass. The photo was of me and my mother, taken before everything. I could see the faint edges of my smile in the picture, a smile that felt foreign to me now. I hadn't looked at that photo closely in years, always too afraid of what it might bring back. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of the fog. I grabbed it, hoping for some distraction, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. A message from an unknown number. "Still running, Jane?" My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had my number? How could John? No, there was no way he could have sent this. I hadn't given him my personal number, and even if he had it, why now? Why this? I felt exposed, like there were eyes on me from every corner of the room. I walked to the window, peeking out into the street below. But everything looked normal. People walked by, cars passed in the distance, the world moved on like nothing was happening. But I knew something was. I could feel it, creeping under my skin. I locked the door behind me and checked it twice, pacing the living room. My mind kept circling back to John, his words in the session playing over and over again. How long have you been running from it? What was he trying to say? Why was he pushing me? And more importantly, how did he know so much? I couldn't ignore it anymore. John wasn't just a patient. He wasn't some man with amnesia, struggling to piece his life back together. There was more, something darker. But what terrified me more than anything was that part of me wanted to know. Wanted to dig deeper, to confront him, to ask him how he knew me, how he knew everything. I picked up my phone again, staring at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. I wanted to call the number, demand answers, but I knew that would be a mistake. Whoever was watching, whoever had sent that, they wanted me to react, to panic. So instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, the air around me thick with unease, and began to scroll through every detail of John's file, looking for anything I might have missed. I scrolled through John's file, my fingers trembling just enough to make me clumsy. I had read this before, several times in fact. But now, under the flickering light of the kitchen, everything seemed sharper, more urgent. His medical records, the police reports, every line felt like it was hiding something I hadn't noticed before. But it was all the same. Just a man with no past, found on the side of the road after a car crash. No family, no history, no fingerprints on any database. A blank slate, except for the way he looked at me, the way he knew things about my life that he shouldn't. I couldn't explain it, and that terrified me. My phone buzzed again, and I jumped, nearly knocking the chair over as I stood. Another message. "Stop looking, Jane." My pulse hammered in my ears. I hadn't told anyone I was looking through John's file. How could they know? I dropped the phone on the table, backing away from it like it might explode. Whoever this was, they were watching me. I felt it. Every shadow, every corner of my apartment seemed to shift, like someone was just out of sight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. I couldn't stay here. I needed air, something to clear my head. My thoughts were spinning too fast, crashing into one another, making it hard to breathe. I checked the lock twice before stepping out into the hall, but even there, the feeling of being watched followed me. I could sense it, creeping up behind me, and wrapping itself around my throat. I quickened my pace, practically running down the stairs and out into the street. The city buzzed with the usual chaos, cars honking, people moving in every direction, but it felt distant, like I was watching it from behind glass. As I walked, my mind raced through the possibilities. Was it someone from the clinic? Did John somehow know where I lived? And how? The idea seemed impossible, but nothing about this felt real anymore. I turned the corner and froze. Standing across the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlight, was a man. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in my bones. John. He didn't move, didn't try to cross the street. He just stood there, watching me with that same eerie stillness, the way he did in my office. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. I pulled it out, dialing the clinic, needing to hear someone else's voice to tether myself to reality. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Dr. Mathis, we've been expecting your call," a voice answered. But it wasn't anyone from the clinic. It wasn't anyone I knew. My blood went cold. "Who is this?" I whispered, my throat tightening. I glanced back at the street, but John was gone, vanished, like he was never there. The voice on the other end chuckled softly. "You really shouldn't have looked so deep. Now you'll have to remember everything." I hung up, my hands shaking. I didn't know where to go, what to do. But one thing was clear, this wasn't about John anymore. This was about me, my past, the attack I thought I had buried. Somehow, I had let it back in. And now, whatever I had tried so hard to forget was coming for me, piece by piece, memory by memory. My name is Austin Tilden, and I used to work with my dad at our family's morgue. It's not the kind of job you choose, it's more like something you grow into. My dad, Tommy, was always the practical one, the type who didn't flinch at death. For me, it took longer to get used to it. Handling dead bodies wasn't exactly easy at first, but after a while, you start treating it like any other routine. You have to, or it'll mess with your head. Our town didn't have much going on. A few accidents here and there, maybe a heart attack. That was pretty much the extent of our work, until the day they brought her in. It was late, past dinner, when Sheriff Burke knocked on the door. I remember because I was still thinking about the lasagna I left half-eaten on the kitchen counter. Dad opened the door, and I could tell by his face that something was off. Burke wasn't the type to show up unless things were bad. "We've got one for you." "Found her on the outskirts of town," he said, his voice lower than usual. When they wheeled the stretcher in, I noticed how pale she looked. Pale, but not in the way we were used to. This was different. "Jane Doe," Burke muttered as we stood over her, like that explained anything. No ID, no belongings, just her body wrapped in a thin, tattered sheet. I was expecting to see signs of trauma, blood, bruises, something that would explain how she ended up in our care, but there was nothing. Just her. Dad gave me a glance, the kind that said we'd have a long night ahead of us. We prepped the room, the same way we always did. Bright overhead lights, sterile surfaces, instruments laid out in perfect order. It was routine, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't quite shake. We started the examination like we always do, making small talk to keep things moving. Dad was going through his checklist, narrating as he went. No external injuries, no visible trauma, skin's in good condition. But as we went on, things started feeling wrong. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead. Not unusual, but they seemed too clear, almost like she could still see. I found myself glancing at them, half expecting a blink. "Austin," Dad's voice pulled me back. "Check her lungs." I positioned myself, did as he asked. That's when it hit me. The lungs were burned. Not just damaged, charred, like someone had set a fire inside her chest. I froze, trying to make sense of it. No smoke, no signs of inhalation, just scorched tissue. "Dad, come take a look at this," I muttered, my voice barely steady. He walked over, peered down, and for the first time, I saw something like confusion flicker across his face. "That doesn't make any sense," he said, mostly to himself. He ran his hand through his hair, then grabbed a scalpel to continue. I could tell he didn't want to stop. The more we found, the deeper we went. Broken bones with no external injuries. Internal bruising that seemed impossible. Every new discovery just made her more of a mystery, and the unease I'd been feeling turned into something else, something darker. The radio in the corner crackled, cutting through the stillness of the room. Static. Then, just as quickly, it went silent. "Damned old thing," Dad grumbled, but his voice was tighter than before. He wasn't the superstitious type, but even he was starting to feel it. I could see it in the way his hands shook, just a little, as he worked. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every time I looked away from the body, it felt like Jane Doe's eyes were still on me, even though they hadn't moved. My rational mind knew that was impossible, but logic wasn't doing me much good. Dad hadn't said anything for a while, and that was starting to get to me. He always kept things moving, talking through the process, but now there was this weird silence between us. He was examining her wrists, looking for any signs of restraint. "No ligature marks," he muttered, mostly to himself. I kept my distance, staying by the counter where the tools were laid out, pretending to organize them even though I didn't need to. My hands were clammy, and I kept wiping them on my scrubs without even realizing it. "Dad," I finally said, breaking the silence, "what do you think happened to her?" He didn't answer right away, just kept working, his brow furrowed in that way it gets when he's deep in thought. "I don't know, Austin," he said after a long pause. "I've never seen anything like this. It doesn't add up." That wasn't what I wanted to hear. He was supposed to be the one with the answers. He'd been doing this for years, and there was a part of me that believed nothing could shake him. But now, seeing him struggle to explain what we were finding, it was like a crack in the foundation. If he didn't know what was going on, how the hell was I supposed to handle it? The lights flickered again, just for a second, but long enough to make me jump. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out more like a cough. "You sure we shouldn't just call it a night?" I asked, half joking, half hoping he'd agree. But he didn't even look up. "We're almost done," he said, his voice clipped. I could tell he was on edge too, even if he didn't want to admit it. He reached for the scalpel again, making the next incision, and that's when the smell hit us. It wasn't the usual decay or rot we were used to. It was something else, something metallic and sharp, like burnt copper. I gagged, stepping back instinctively. "What the hell is that?" I said, covering my nose with the crook of my arm. Dad didn't answer right away, just stared down at the incision he'd made. His face had gone pale, but not from the smell. "Her organs," he whispered, they're not right." He gestured for me to come closer, but every instinct I had was telling me to stay back. Still, I forced myself to move, stepping up beside him and looking down into the open cavity. My stomach churned. Her organs looked wrong. Twisted, like they'd been rearranged or mutilated somehow, but there was no external damage, no signs of surgery or trauma. "That's not possible," I said, my voice cracking. "I know," Dad replied, his hands shaking now. He stepped back from the table, rubbing his eyes like he was trying to shake off a bad dream. "We need to figure this out. There's got to be an explanation." But I wasn't so sure anymore. I couldn't stop staring at her. The body wasn't just lifeless. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, in this world. I kept thinking maybe we'd missed something, some explanation that could make all of this make sense. But the deeper we went, the more impossible it became to ignore the fact that none of this should be happening. Dad, usually so composed, was pacing now, his hands flexing open and closed like he was trying to figure out how to fix something that couldn't be fixed. "We need to go over this again," he muttered, mostly to himself, grabbing a fresh pair of gloves from the counter. His voice was tight, strained, like he was trying to hold it together. But I could hear the crack underneath. He wasn't in control anymore, and that scared me more than anything. "Dad," I started, but he cut me off. Just help me finish this, okay?" His voice had an edge to it, like he was barely keeping it together. I watched as he approached the table again, but something stopped me from following him. My feet felt rooted to the ground, like some part of me knew better than to keep going. But then the lights flickered again, this time longer, and I heard a sound, soft but clear, like something shifting in the dark corners of the room. I froze, staring toward the shadows by the cabinets. I knew it couldn't be possible. We were alone. We had to be alone. But there it was again, that faint noise like fabric dragging across the floor. My throat tightened, my heart thudding in my chest as I turned slowly, half expecting to see something standing there. Nothing. just the sterile metal of the cabinets and the cold white walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, just out of sight. "Austin, focus," Dad said sharply, pulling me back to the moment. He was bent over Jane Doe's body again, eyes fixed on the mess of organs inside her. "I need you to hold the light." I forced myself to move, picking up the small overhead lamp and angling it toward the body, but my hands were shaking and the beam wobbled across her skin. As the light hit her chest, I noticed something I hadn't before. At first, it looked like a scar, barely visible against the pale flesh. But when I leaned closer, I saw it wasn't a scar at all. It was a mark, a symbol etched into her skin, almost like it had been burned there long ago. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely there. "Look." He followed my gaze, his face going pale as he saw the symbol. "What the hell is that?" he breathed, reaching out with one gloved hand to trace the edge of the mark. It was rough, jagged, like whoever had done it hadn't cared about the pain it would cause. This wasn't here before," he stammered, pulling his hand back quickly, like the mark had burned him. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it must have always been there, and we just hadn't seen it. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure. It felt like the body was changing, like we weren't just uncovering the mystery, we were a part of it now. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't breathe right, and my mind was racing with questions I didn't want answers to. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why did it feel like, with every second we spent in that room, we were getting closer to something we couldn't come back from? "Maybe we should stop," I said, finally finding my voice. Dad looked at me, eyes wide, searching for an answer I couldn't give him. But he didn't move. Neither did I. I stood there, staring at the mark on her chest, trying to make sense of it. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could barely keep the light steady. Dad was pacing again, his movements jerky, like he was fighting the urge to bolt out of the room. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to slam shut on us, trapping us with this thing that had somehow come alive on the table. It didn't make sense. None of it did. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what we had seen so far, but nothing added up. Burned lungs, shattered bones, and now this strange symbol. It was like someone, or something, was sending us a message. "Are you sure we didn't miss this before?" I asked, though I wasn't even sure I wanted to hear the answer. My voice sounded shaky, weak. I felt like a kid again, looking to my dad to tell me everything was fine, even when I knew it wasn't. "I don't know, Austin," Dad muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He leaned against the counter, his eyes flicking back to the body every few seconds like he couldn't help himself. It's beyond anything we've dealt with." That was an understatement. I wanted to say something, but every word stuck in my throat. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on right away. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound my breathing, loud and uneven in the sudden blackness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some kind of light, but my hands were trembling, and I nearly dropped it. When the screen finally lit up, the small glow barely cut through the thick shadow hanging over the room. "Dad?" I whispered, even though he was only a few feet away. "I'm here," he replied, his voice strained. "Stay close." Something clattered across the floor, and I jumped, shining the light toward the source of the sound. One of the tools had fallen, but no one had touched it. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to swallow down the panic rising in my chest. This wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. I didn't care how it sounded anymore. "Now." Dad didn't argue. He just nodded, his face pale in the glow from my phone. We both moved toward the door, our steps slow, like we were afraid of disturbing whatever was in the room with us. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. The door handle was cold, almost too cold, as I wrapped my fingers around it and pulled. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, rattling the handle, but it was stuck. "Dad," I said, turning to him, panic setting in now. "It's locked." "That's not possible," he muttered, his eyes darting to the control panel on the wall. The door wasn't locked. We never locked it while we were working. He pushed past me, trying the handle himself, but it wouldn't move. His face tightened, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. I backed up, my mind racing. What What the hell is happening? Dad didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the door, his hand still gripping the handle like he could force it open with sheer willpower. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the table, toward her. Jane Doe, still lying there, unmoving, her chest open, her face blank, as if she hadn't caused all of this chaos. But I knew better now. I knew something was wrong. She was wrong. We both stood frozen, watching the body, waiting for something to happen, though we didn't know what. And then, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as we stared at the body. The room was suffocating, but it wasn't the darkness or the locked door. It was her. Jane Doe. Lying there like nothing had changed, but I knew it had. We both did. Dad was still gripping the door handle, frozen in place, as if he couldn't bring himself to let go. I wanted to run, to get as far away from her as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck in place, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of this nightmare. Suddenly, the light on my phone flickered and died, plunging us back into darkness. No, I muttered, frantically tapping the screen, but it wouldn't turn back on. I could hear Dad's breathing getting faster, more frantic. He was losing it. I was losing it. Then, from somewhere in the pitch black, came a soft, creaking noise. Slow, deliberate, like something moving. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to speak. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. I didn't need him to confirm it. The noise came again, this time louder, closer, like someone or something was shifting on the table. "Dad, please tell me you heard that." My voice cracked, barely audible, but he didn't answer. I turned toward where I thought he was standing, but the space felt empty. I called his name again, louder this time. Still nothing. Panic surged through me. He was right next to me just a second ago. Then the lights flickered back on. Dim at first, like they were struggling to stay alive. My eyes darted to the table, and that's when I saw it. Dad wasn't at the door anymore. He was standing at the foot of the autopsy table, staring down at Jane Doe's body, his face blank, almost calm. Too calm. "Dad?" My voice was shaking now, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. I took a step closer, but something in me screamed not to go any further. There was something wrong with him. I could feel it. His hands were at his sides, hanging loose, but there was something off about his posture, like he wasn't in control of himself anymore. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. His head tilted slightly, like he had just heard me for the first time, but he still didn't move. The lights flickered again, buzzing faintly above us. Then, without warning, he leaned over the body, his hands reaching out toward her, slow and deliberate. "Dad, stop!" I shouted, but he didn't. He pressed his hands down on her chest, his fingers tracing the symbol we had found earlier. I rushed forward, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him away, but he didn't even flinch. It was like he couldn't hear me at all. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his pupils blown. He whispered something under his breath, too quiet for me to catch. That's when her eyes opened. My stomach dropped. They weren't her eyes anymore. They were dark, bottomless, like staring into a void. Her lips moved, barely parting, but I heard the words, "He's mine now." I yanked Dad back, finally breaking his grip, and he collapsed to the floor, limp, as if whatever had taken hold of him had let go. I stood over him, shaking, my mind racing. The lights flickered one last time and went out completely. This time, they didn't come back on. In the dark, I could still feel her eyes on me. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling wasn't mine. It took a few seconds for my mind to catch up. This was the clinic. My clinic. But something wasn't right. My heart started pounding, an odd sensation in my chest as I noticed the restraints on my wrists. I pulled at them, trying to make sense of it. Why was I here? The room felt smaller, suffocating in a way it never had before. The door creaked open, and in walked Dr. Hartman. I knew him, worked with him for years. But the look on his face, it wasn't the one of a colleague. It was the look I'd seen him give to patients when things had gone too far. "Miranda, how are you feeling?" His voice was too calm, too measured, like he didn't expect me to understand. "What's going on?" My voice came out shaky, unfamiliar. "Why am I in here?" Dr. Hartman sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting across from me. "Miranda, do you remember anything about what happened?" My pulse quickened and I shook my head, confusion wrapping around me like a fog. What was he talking about? What happened? Why am I here? He glanced down at his clipboard, avoiding my eyes. You've been here for 3 days, Miranda. You're being treated as a patient. A chill crept through me. That's impossible. I was fine. I was working. My breath caught as memories slipped in, disjointed and incomplete. I had been at home with Doug, my husband, and then nothing. Hartman's eyes flicked back to me, his tone softening as he delivered the next blow. Miranda, your husband is dead. They say you killed him. The words hit me like a freight train, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Doug? Dead? The room swayed and I felt the bile rise in my throat. No, that's not true, I whispered, my voice trembling. I couldn't have. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The evidence points to you, Miranda, and until we can figure out what happened, you're going to stay here. I sat there, numb, trying to process the impossible. It felt like I had stepped out of my own life into someone else's nightmare. How could I not remember something so horrific? I spent the next few hours trying to convince myself this was some kind of mistake, a twisted nightmare I'd wake up from. But the sterile walls, the restraints on my wrists, the way the staff looked at me, it all felt too real. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had happened. I just didn't know what. The gap in my memory, that blank space where there should have been something, anything, was terrifying. My mind kept circling back to Doug, his face. The last thing I remembered was us having dinner. We didn't even argue. So how did things go so wrong? I lay back on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, my pulse racing. Doug's dead, I muttered to myself, testing the words, trying to make them fit into my reality. But it didn't. There was no way I could have done that. No way I could have hurt him. And yet, why couldn't I remember? Why did I feel like I was drowning, unable to grasp onto anything solid? Every memory of Doug came rushing back, but none of them explained this. The dinners, the late-night talks, the small arguments that never lasted. We weren't perfect, but it made no sense. The door creaked open again, and a nurse stepped in, carrying a tray. You should eat something, Dr. Gray. She didn't meet my eyes, placing the tray on a small table by the bed. Her voice was kind, but there was something in the way she moved, like she didn't quite trust me, like I was a stranger to her now. I don't belong here, I said, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. This is some kind of mistake. I didn't. She cut me off before I could finish. Dr. Hartman will be in to see you later. Try to rest. She left without another word, the sound of the door closing behind her sending a shiver down my spine. Rest. How was I supposed to rest? My head was pounding with questions, none of which I had answers to. I knew I needed to piece it together, but every time I tried to push through the fog, it got thicker, murkier. Something felt wrong, not just about Doug, about everything. I sat up, trying to force my thoughts into some sort of order. What if I was missing something? What if there was more to this than just a memory lapse? The idea crept in slowly, uncomfortably. A cold knot settled in my stomach as my mind started playing tricks on me, replaying flashes of that night, or at least what I thought might have been that night. Did I see something? Someone? The feeling of being watched? No, it wasn't possible. But the unease wouldn't go away. And the worst part was there was no one I could trust, not even myself. The following day, they took me to Dr. Hartman. His office was in a part of the building I'd never been before, somewhere deep within the clinic. As they wheeled me down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The walls felt narrower here, the light dimmer, and the air colder. It made no sense, but everything felt off. Wrong. Like I didn't belong in this place. Or maybe like something else did. Dr. Hartman was already seated when they brought me in. He was flipping through a folder, eyes scanning the pages like he'd seen it all before. My file, no doubt. He glanced up when I was finally seated in front of him. Miranda, he began, his voice as calm as ever, like I was just another patient, just another case to him. How are you feeling today? I shouldn't be here, I said, my throat tightening. You know me, Hartman. We've worked together for years. I didn't kill Doug. I couldn't have. I don't even remember. That's exactly what we need to talk about. He leaned forward, hands clasped together. The police found you with the body, Miranda. The evidence is compelling, but I'm more interested in what you think happened. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I stared at him, the weight of what he was saying slowly sinking in. The body. Doug's body. Was that where the memory gap started? My heart raced. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain that I didn't even remember the most important moment of my life, or his death? I don't know what happened, I stammered, but I couldn't have done it, I swear. Hartman didn't react, his eyes cool and calculating. Miranda, dissociation is not uncommon in cases of trauma. It's possible your mind is protecting itself, blocking out the memory of what you did. But I didn't do it, I snapped, feeling my pulse quicken. I loved him. Why would I? My voice cracked, and I forced myself to stop, breathing deeply, trying to regain control. But the truth was, I couldn't trust myself anymore. What if Hartman was right? What if my mind had turned on me? He leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile on his face. I think we both know there's more going on here, Miranda. I've seen it before. Trauma, guilt, even something more, insidious. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was something else there, something darker, colder. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. He knew something I didn't. The way he looked at me, it was almost like he was waiting for me to realize it. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was speaking to a doctor or something else entirely. Every night, the same dream tormented me. I'd see Doug, but he was different. His eyes hollow, his expression twisted into something unrecognizable. He'd reach out to me, but I couldn't move. I'd wake up in a sweat, gasping for air, the lingering sensation of his cold touch still on my skin. It was as if the dreams were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't grasp what. My nights were filled with dread, my days consumed by a relentless anxiety I couldn't shake. One evening, a nurse named Laura came by my room. Her face was a mask of sympathy, but her eyes, there was something off about them. "Miranda," she said softly, "we need to talk about your progress." She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Dr. Hartman wants to see you again. He says it's urgent." I nodded, but my mind raced. What now? Had they found something else, or was this just another session of the same probing questions? I could hardly keep track anymore. As Laura led me down the hall, I felt a prickling sensation, like eyes following me. I turned, but no one was there, just shadows and the sterile, clinical emptiness that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Dr. Hartman's office felt colder than usual. He sat behind his desk, looking as calm and collected as ever. "Miranda," he began, his voice smooth and even, "I've reviewed some of the footage from the security cameras. You were caught on tape near the scene. It's unsettling." "What footage?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I don't remember being there." "That's the problem," he said, leaning forward, his fingers steepled. "There are gaps in your memory, and the footage doesn't lie. We need to understand why these gaps exist." I felt my pulse quicken. "I'm telling you, I don't remember anything. I've been trying to piece together what happened, but nothing makes sense." Hartman's gaze was piercing. "Sometimes, Miranda, our minds can protect us from the truth. But there are other forces at play here. Forces that might be influencing you." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused and alarmed. "Are you saying something else is behind this?" He hesitated, then said, "I've been working here long enough to know when something isn't right. There are rumors, old stories about this place. Some believe that the building holds memories, that it can influence those who are most vulnerable." A chill ran through me. "Are you saying this place is haunted?" he finished for me. "I don't know, but I do know that your experience is more than just a case of trauma. I need you to trust me and help me uncover what's really happening." Laura came in just then, her face pale. "Dr. Hartman, there's been another incident in the East Wing. We need to investigate immediately." Hartman's eyes flickered with concern. "We'll continue this discussion later, Miranda. For now, stay calm and try to recall anything that might be helpful." As I walked back to my room, I felt an unsettling awareness. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The whispers of the building, if they even existed, seemed louder than ever. I was caught in a web of my own mind, and something, or someone, was tugging the strings. I awoke to the sound of a door creaking open. The hospital's dim lights filtered through the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows across my room. I had finally managed to fall into an uneasy sleep after hours of staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together my fragmented memories. The creeping dread from earlier had not dissipated. If anything, it had intensified. "Miranda," A voice called out softly, cutting through the dark. It was Dr. Hartman. "I need you to come with me." I hesitated, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. "What's happening?" "There's something you need to see," he replied, his tone serious but not alarmed. I noticed the concern in his eyes as he motioned for me to follow him. As we walked through the dimly lit hallways, the usual buzz of fluorescent lights felt oppressive. Each step echoed louder than the last, amplifying the tension that built in my chest. My mind raced. What could be so urgent that it required me to leave my room? And why did it feel like we were being watched? Hartman led me to a small, locked room in the east wing. He unlocked the door with a key and gestured for me to enter first. Inside, the room was sparse, filled with old medical equipment and dusty files. The atmosphere was cold and impersonal. "There's something here," Hartman said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a folder from one of the dusty shelves. "This contains records of previous patients who have experienced similar symptoms. Look closely at this." He handed me a photograph. At first, it appeared to be an old family portrait, but as I studied it more, a chilling realization set in. The faces of the people in the photograph were eerily familiar. One of them resembled Doug, my late husband. My breath caught in my throat. "Why do these people look like my husband?" I asked, my voice trembling. Hartman's expression hardened. "Because they're connected to your case. There have been other doctors, other patients who experienced unexplained phenomena here. Some believe this place has a dark history, a history that is repeating itself with you." I stared at the photograph, feeling a growing sense of dread. "Are you saying that the building is causing this? That it's somehow controlling my mind?" "It's a possibility," Hartman said, "but I need you to stay focused. There's something else you should know." He took a deep breath and continued. "We found security footage showing you near Doug's room the night he died. But there's a strange anomaly in the video. It's almost like someone was interfering with it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you suggesting that someone else is behind this? That I'm not responsible?" "That's what we're trying to uncover," Hartman said. "We need to get to the bottom of this, Miranda. I believe there's something or someone influencing these events, but we're running out of time." As he spoke, I noticed a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. My heart raced with a mix of fear and disbelief. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter as if they were trying to contain a secret too horrifying to reveal. Hartman's words echoed in my mind. Something or someone influencing these events. What did that mean for me? Was I truly being manipulated, or was this all a result of my own unraveling sanity? The uncertainty was suffocating. I needed answers, but every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into a maze of shadows and whispers. And as I looked at Hartman, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be hiding something too. The room's lights flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I felt as though the building itself was watching me, waiting to unveil its darkest secrets. The answers were within reach, but the more I learned, the more I felt like I was losing my grasp on reality. As I left the room, a single thought echoed in my mind. What if the real horror wasn't just the supernatural forces at play, but the terrifying possibility that my own mind was turning against me? Cells don't just divide, they evolve, adapt, and sometimes they rebel. That was the thought running through my head the first time I saw it. The anomaly. It wasn't supposed to happen. Everything had been going smoothly. The cultures were stable, responding to treatment exactly as predicted. For weeks, the regenerative therapy had shown promise, even outperforming my expectations. But then, the cells began to change. Not gradually, like I might expect with any minor mutation. It was fast, aggressive, as if they had a will of their own. I remember staring at the microscope, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. "What the hell is this?" I muttered under my breath, leaning closer, adjusting the focus as if that would somehow provide an answer. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The once uniform cell structures had started to morph, their shapes distorting in ways I'd never seen before. I knew I should have called in the team, but something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or pride. After all, this was my discovery, my breakthrough. I couldn't let someone else steal the spotlight. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. Maybe it's contamination. Maybe there was a problem with the sample. But no matter how many times I ran the test, no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the anomaly persisted. The cells weren't just multiplying, they were adapting, almost evolving. They reacted to stimuli in ways that defied everything I knew about cellular biology. It was as if they were learning. By the time I ran the fourth test, I felt the first wave of unease creeping in. Not panic, not yet, but something. The lab was quiet, the soft hum of the equipment and the faint fluorescent lights giving me just enough comfort to keep going. I could hear my own heartbeat, faint but steady, as I isolated the mutated culture. I'll figure this out, I told myself. I'm in control here. But then the dreams started. Vivid, disjointed images of cells multiplying, shifting, warping into forms I couldn't recognize. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my body tense, feeling like I'd just run a marathon. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the stress of the project getting to me. I've handled worse, after all. It wasn't the first time a breakthrough had led to sleepless nights, but this was different. It felt personal, like something was digging its claws into my mind. A few days later, I was in the lab again, staring at the cells as they continued their bizarre transformation. My hands hovered over the keyboard, documenting every change, every erratic shift. They weren't just mutating, they were behaving. That's ridiculous, I thought, shaking my head. Cells don't behave, they don't think. But it was the only word that fit. What's wrong, Ethan? Sarah, my lab assistant, startled me from behind. I hadn't even noticed her come in. I glanced over my shoulder, the weight of her stare heavy on my back. Nothing, I lied, quickly minimizing the screen. Just running some final tests. She didn't buy it. You've been here for days. Whatever you're working on, it's consuming you. You need to take a break. She was right, of course. I could feel the exhaustion, the strain behind my eyes, the subtle tension in my muscles that never quite went away. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close to something monumental, something no one had ever seen before. I thought I could control it. I was wrong. Days after my initial discoveries, the situation began to spiral out of control. I injected a small dose of the modified cells into my bloodstream. The idea was to observe the effects in a living system. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, I was driven by a mix of obsession and desperation. I had to see it through, even if it meant risking my own well-being. The cells were too unpredictable to be studied in a petri dish alone. They needed a real host to show their true potential. The first few days, nothing seemed off. I carried on with my routine, the weight of the research pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. But then the changes started. They were subtle at first. My skin felt slightly more sensitive, as if it was more aware of the world around it. I noticed it while brushing against the lab equipment, or when Sarah touched my arm during one of our brief conversations. "Are you okay, Ethan?" Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts one morning. Her eyes were searching mine, concerned. "You look different." "I'm fine," I replied too quickly, offering a forced smile. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I was starting to experience bizarre sensations. My vision would blur unpredictably, and sounds seemed to distort. It was as if my senses were playing tricks on me. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to shift and move, making me doubt my own perceptions. One night, as I worked late in the lab, I glanced at my reflection in the glass of the microscope. The face staring back at me was almost alien. My features appeared sharper, more defined, and my eyes seemed to glow with an unsettling intensity. I tried to rationalize it as fatigue, but deep down, I knew something was deeply wrong. I felt like I was no longer fully in control of my own body. The hallucinations began after that. I'd be at my desk, the hum of the equipment in the background, and suddenly, the lines on the paper would writhe and twist, becoming grotesque patterns. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I found it hard to focus on anything for long. I was losing my grip on reality. I had to keep telling myself it was just stress, just exhaustion. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more elusive the comfort became. Then came the night when I woke up screaming. I was alone in my apartment, but the walls seemed to close in on me. I could hear whispers, low, incoherent murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. They grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't tell if they were real or just a product of my deteriorating sanity. I staggered to the lab, desperate to prove that it was all just a bad dream. But the lab was no refuge. The same eerie sensations followed me, and the mutated cells seemed to pulse with a life of their own, reacting to my fear. "Why are you still here, Ethan?" Sarah's voice echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of her concern. I could almost hear her in the lab, her voice full of worry. I had to push through it, to finish what I had started. But with each passing day, the line between reality and madness blurred further. I was unraveling, and whatever was happening to me was only getting worse. The answers I sought were slipping through my fingers, replaced by a growing terror that I couldn't escape. Every day felt like a descent into chaos. I woke up to find my apartment transformed into a battleground between my sanity and the disturbing changes inside me. The mundane had turned sinister. Even the most routine tasks seemed fraught with a creeping dread. The reflection in the mirror showed a stranger's face, one marked by fatigue and something more unsettling. My skin seemed to shimmer, and my eyes held an intensity that I couldn't explain. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. The symptoms grew worse. My sense of time became unreliable. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me, their angles sharp and oppressive. I found myself isolating in the lab, desperate to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting. My hands shook uncontrollably whenever I tried to handle the samples, the tools slipping through my fingers as if they had a life of their own. I could barely concentrate on the data that flashed across my screens. One evening, Sarah came by the lab unannounced. She looked worried, her eyes darting around as she took in the state of the place. "Ethan, you need to stop this," she said firmly. "You're not yourself. You've been working nonstop." "I'm fine," I insisted, though the words felt hollow. "I just need to get this right. I'm so close to understanding what's happening." Her gaze was piercing, filled with concern. "You're pushing yourself too hard. I can't stand seeing you like this. Please, take a break." But how could I explain it to her? The dread that gnawed at me, the constant feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the lab or the data, it was everywhere. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, each shadow carrying the weight of my fears. I dismissed her, not out of spite, but because I couldn't afford to pause. Not when I was on the brink of uncovering something that might finally make sense of the horror I was living through. I continued working alone, consumed by the drive to uncover answers. The lab became my refuge and my prison. The mutated cells seemed to respond to my fear, growing in ways that defied explanation. They pulsed with a rhythmic pattern, almost as if they were alive in their own way. I'd spend hours just staring at them, trying to discern any familiar pattern, but finding only chaos and unpredictability. Sleep eluded me, replaced by vivid nightmares. My dreams were filled with twisted visions of cells multiplying uncontrollably, their forms merging into grotesque shapes. I woke up each time with a start, drenched in sweat. The images burned into my mind. The more I tried to fight it, the more real it felt. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and fascination, unable to escape the grip of my own creation. Then came the night when everything changed. I was at my desk, working late into the early hours, when I noticed a sudden drop in the lab's temperature. My breath came out in visible puffs. The lights flickered erratically, and a deep, unsettling hum filled the room. I could see the mutated cells under the microscope, writhing and shifting in ways that defied explanation. I could almost hear them whispering, as if communicating with each other. My hands trembled as I realized the truth. I was no longer in control. Whatever was happening to me was spreading, affecting everything around me. I had become a part of the experiment in ways I hadn't anticipated. The dread of what lay ahead gripped me, leaving me on edge, uncertain of what the next moment would bring. I'd reached a point where reality and madness were indistinguishable. My grip on what was real had become increasingly tenuous. Each day was a struggle to separate my fears from facts. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant diving into the abyss of my own mind. One afternoon, while reviewing the data, I found something unsettling. In the genetic sequences I'd been studying, I noticed anomalies that couldn't be attributed to simple mutations. They were patterns that suggested a foreign influence, something beyond the scope of my original research. It was as if the cells were not just changing, but being controlled. The realization struck me like a cold wave. The source of the contamination wasn't random. I dug through old expedition logs, trying to connect the dots. The Amazon trip was supposed to be a routine collection of samples for a separate project. Yet, there was an odd entry about an unusual sample, marked with a warning. It had been collected from a remote area, described as having an unknown pathogen. I dismissed it at the time, focusing instead on the more conventional samples. I had no idea that this sample was now the center of my nightmare. I paced around the lab, the hum of the equipment now a constant, unnerving presence. Every noise seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed darker. I could hear the whispers of my own anxiety growing louder with each passing moment. I started connecting the pieces. Someone had intentionally introduced this pathogen. It wasn't a random error. It was deliberate. My work, my body, my sanity, none of it was an accident. Sarah called again, her voice urgent over the phone. "Ethan, I've been trying to reach you for days. You need to talk to me. I'm worried about you." "I can't right now," I snapped. "There's something I need to understand, something important." "Ethan, please, you're not yourself. Whatever you're chasing, it's consuming you. I can't stand seeing you like this." Her words felt like a distant echo. I was so close to unraveling the truth, yet so far from finding peace. I hung up, the phone slipping from my grip. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, the reality of the situation crashing over me like a wave. I was alone, left with only the dark whispers of my own mind and the haunting realization of what I'd unwittingly unleashed. The next day, I found myself back in the lab, feverishly compiling data, trying to match the patterns I'd found with any known pathogens. The lab lights flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance mockingly on the walls. Each flicker felt like a taunt, a reminder of my deteriorating state. I could see my reflection in the glass of the microscope, and it was clear that my face was a mask of fear and obsession. The more I dug into the data, the clearer it became. The pathogen was engineered to manipulate genetic evolution. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was a planned assault on human biology. My cells were being altered by forces far beyond my control, and I was at the center of it all. The realization left me paralyzed, unable to comprehend the full scope of the conspiracy. All I could do was cling to the hope that I could still find a way to stop it before it consumed everything I had left. I could feel the walls closing in, not just around me, but within me. My thoughts churned in a ceaseless loop, each revelation more horrifying than the last. My body felt like a foreign entity, betraying me with every tremor, every unsteady breath. I was losing myself in a maze of my own making. Desperation drove me to visit the research archives in the university's basement. The old records held potential answers. Perhaps they contained clues about the mysterious pathogen. As I sifted through dusty folders and brittle papers, the dim lighting made everything seem more menacing. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, their shapes playing tricks on my already frayed nerves. Among the records, I found something that stopped me cold. A research proposal from a decade ago, detailing an experiment involving genetic manipulation. The project, led by a researcher named Dr. Victor Hayes, was intended to create a superior strain of human cells. The project had been abruptly shut down due to ethical concerns and unexplained side effects. The name Hayes struck a chord. He was the same researcher whose work had been referenced in the logs from my Amazon expedition. My mind raced. If Hayes was involved in both the abandoned research and the sample that contaminated my work, then the pathogen was part of a larger, more sinister scheme. I recalled the sample's warning label: "Do not use, potential for biohazardous effects." How had I ignored such a blatant warning? How had I let myself become an unwitting participant in a horrific experiment? Returning to the lab, I noticed the cells seemed to have developed a new, disturbing behavior. They no longer just mutated, they began to exhibit what appeared to be conscious responses to my presence. Under the microscope, the cells moved in an organized, almost predatory way. It was as if they were aware of me, of what I had done. The sensation of being watched intensified. As the realization sank in, Sarah arrived at the lab. Her face was drawn with concern. but there was something different in her eyes. "Ethan, I've been looking for you." "I?" She stopped abruptly, her gaze shifting to the microscope. "What's happened here?" "It's not just a pathogen," I said, my voice trembling. "It's a weapon. It's designed to control genetic evolution, and it's already started to affect me." Sarah's face turned pale. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, the lights in the lab flickered and went out. The emergency lights cast an eerie, pale glow. Shadows danced along the walls and the temperature dropped. I could hear the cells in their containers, a low, rhythmic thudding as if they were pulsing in time with a heartbeat. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. The pathogen was not just affecting the cells. It was evolving, adapting, and now it was turning on me. In the dim light, I saw a figure in the doorway. It was Dr. Hayes. He stepped forward, his face calm and expressionless. "I see you've uncovered the truth," he said. "It was only a matter of time." I stared in shock. Hayes' presence was the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. "You planned this all along," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You wanted to see how far the mutation would go." He nodded. "The experiment's real goal was to create a controllable evolutionary path. And now, with the data from your own transformation, we're ready to move on to the next phase. This is only the beginning." As Hayes advanced, I realized there was no escape. The pathogen had already altered the very essence of my being, and now I was trapped in a nightmare I had unwittingly helped create. The lab, once my sanctuary, had become a prison. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my own fear, a relentless reminder of the horrors unleashed. The most subtle side effects often reveal the darkest truths. When we launched our new insomnia medication, I felt a surge of optimism. I'm Dr. Julia Olson, and I've spent years perfecting this formula, believing it would change lives. My team and I had poured our hearts into this project, and the initial trials seemed promising. Patients reported better sleep and fewer disruptions. We were on the brink of a breakthrough, or so I thought. But then the reports started trickling in, patients complaining about disturbing nightmares. At first, I dismissed them as isolated incidents. After all, every medication has side effects, right? But when the complaints became more frequent and consistent, I couldn't ignore the pattern. Each nightmare was vivid and unsettling, almost like a shared experience among different people. Michael Reynolds, my colleague and co-lead on the project, was the first to notice the commonalities in the nightmares. "Julia, look at these reports," he said, his voice tense as he flipped through patient journals. "They're not just nightmares. They're connected. There are recurring themes here." I stared at the data and felt a chill creep over me. The patients were describing similar dark figures, distorted landscapes, and specific scenarios that seemed too precise to be mere coincidence. What could this mean? I wondered aloud. Is our medication causing these dreams, or is something else at play? We decided to dig deeper, conducting thorough interviews with the patients and analyzing their sleep patterns more closely. As the days passed, the nightmares became more intense and the descriptions more disturbing. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, but what? In the quiet of my office, I found myself haunted by the implications. Could our drug be amplifying something deeper within the subconscious? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were tapping into a realm beyond our understanding. It was as though our work had unlocked a door to a part of the mind that was never meant to be accessed. The more I pondered, the more unsettling the situation became. I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that there was something far more sinister behind these nightmares. What had we unleashed? And if this was just the beginning, what awaited us as we continued to unravel this mystery? I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we were missing something crucial. Michael and I began scrutinizing every detail of our clinical trials. We reviewed each patient's medical history, focusing on any shared factors that might explain the nightmares. The deeper we dug, the more perplexing the situation became. I decided to meet with some of the patients to hear their experiences firsthand. One woman, Janet, a schoolteacher, spoke in hushed tones, her eyes wide with fear. "It's like I'm reliving something horrific," she said. "The dreams are so real, and I see the same things over and over, dark rooms, shadowy figures. It feels like they're watching me." Michael and I exchanged glances. Janet's description matched the patterns we had seen in the reports. We asked her to recount more details. I've seen people I don't recognize, but they feel familiar. It's as if they're from a place I've been before, Janet said, her voice trembling. As I drove home that night, the images from Janet's account replayed in my mind. The darkness she described seemed to seep into my thoughts. I couldn't ignore the mounting sense of dread. What if our medication was tapping into something far deeper, something we had no control over? The next day, we took another step, investigating the origins of our drug. We revisited the research notes and discovered an obscure project from years ago. It involved a series of tests on memory enhancement and subconscious connections, but it had been abruptly terminated. The data had been buried, and we had never seen it before. Michael's face was pale as he read through the old documents. Julia, this isn't just about sleep. This drug, it's acting as a conduit. It's not just amplifying nightmares. It's connecting people to something hidden in their minds. The realization was jarring. We were opening a door to something we barely understood, and the implications were terrifying. What exactly were we amplifying? And why did the old research involve such drastic measures? As these questions haunted me, the nightmares continued to plague my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and something darker. The more we uncovered, the more it felt like we were slipping into a deeper, darker abyss. Michael and I spent long hours poring over the old research papers. They spoke of experiments designed to unlock hidden parts of the mind, to enhance memory and tap into repressed trauma. The more I read, the more I felt a chilling realization. Our new drug wasn't just amplifying nightmares. It was awakening something buried within people's minds. The breakthrough came when we traced the origins of the drug's formula. It was derived from compounds used in the old experiments. Those experiments were supposed to be about enhancing cognitive function, but the side effects were anything but benign. We were effectively reintroducing those same compounds, but in a form far more potent. One evening, as I reviewed the data alone in my office, I noticed a pattern emerging in the nightmare reports. Each patient's experiences seemed to tie back to the same traumatic events described in the old research. It was as though the drug was unlocking a collective memory, one that wasn't just personal, but deeply interconnected. I felt a growing sense of dread. Could our medication be acting as a conduit to a shared unconscious memory? I brought my findings to Michael. "These nightmares aren't random," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my insides. "They're all connected to the old project. Our drug isn't just influencing dreams, it's connecting them to something real, something we didn't fully understand." Michael's face grew serious. "If we're right, this means our medication is tapping into a network of repressed memories, linking them across different people. This wasn't intended, Julia. This wasn't part of the plan." We decided to delve into the old files more deeply, hoping to find something that would explain the connection. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear that the previous research had been far from benign. The experiments had sought to manipulate and control, pushing the boundaries of ethical science. Late one night, as I prepared for bed, I was jolted awake by a sudden, vivid image, a scene from one of the nightmares I had read about. It was like a message, a glimpse into the collective terror our drug had unleashed. The lines between the nightmares and reality were blurring, and I realized the nightmare I saw wasn't just a figment of someone's imagination. It was something that had happened, something that had been hidden for years. The more I tried to piece together the information, the more I felt that we were on the brink of uncovering something monumental. The old research wasn't just about enhancing cognition. It was about controlling minds, about unlocking and exploiting the darkest corners of the human psyche. And now our medication was reopening those doors, connecting our patients to a horrifying truth that had been buried for far too long. We were knee-deep in chaos, with no clear path forward. Michael and I found ourselves tangled in a web of our own making. The deeper we dug, the more the fragments of the old research revealed a disturbing truth. The drug was not only amplifying nightmares, it was somehow bringing the old experiments back to life, making our patients relive traumatic memories as if they were their own. One evening, as I sifted through patient reports, I felt an unsettling sense of déjà vu. The details in the nightmares were too specific, too aligned with the old research. It became clear that these weren't isolated incidents. They were parts of a larger, darker pattern. Each patient seemed to be experiencing echoes of the same fear, a collective terror that tied back to the project we'd unearthed. My hands trembled as I reviewed the data. Michael sat across from me, his eyes reflecting the same anxiety I felt. "Julia, this is more than just side effects. The drug is connecting people to something profound and horrifying. It's like it's awakening something that was buried deep within them." "I know," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "The connections are too precise. These nightmares, they're tied to the old experiments. Our medication is acting as a bridge, pulling memories and fears from somewhere dark and hidden." We decided it was crucial to confront the company executives. Michael and I prepared a presentation detailing our findings and the risks involved. The meeting was set for the following day, and as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to face something beyond our control. When we met with the executives, I felt their initial dismissiveness. They were more concerned with the market potential than the implications of our findings. But as I spoke, I saw their expressions shift. The anxiety in their eyes told me that they knew more than they were letting on. As the days passed, the nightmares grew more intense. I began experiencing them myself. Each night, I relived horrific scenarios that felt all too real. I woke up disoriented and terrified, grappling with the blurred line between dream and reality. The fear wasn't just in the patients' minds, it was seeping into mine too. I started doubting my sanity, wondering if I was losing touch with reality. Michael and I realized that the drug wasn't just a catalyst, it was a tool for uncovering buried truths. It seemed to be unraveling layers of consciousness that had been carefully concealed. The old project, with its unethical practices, had left scars on the collective unconscious, and our medication was ripping those scars open. As we confronted these revelations, we knew we had to act fast to prevent further damage. But as the nightmare continued to evolve, it became clear that some truths might be better left undisturbed. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The old project wasn't just a dark chapter in our lab's history. It was the foundation of the nightmare we'd unleashed. The drug didn't merely amplify fears, it was merging past experiments with the present, creating a bridge between suppressed memories and a shared consciousness. What started as a quest for curing insomnia had spiraled into a grotesque exploration of human psyche. Michael and I were racing against time. We had to shut down the clinical trials, but the company's reluctance and bureaucratic red tape seemed endless. Every attempt to alert the higher-ups was met with dismissive nods and empty promises. One evening, Michael's frustration boiled over. "We're losing control, Julia. This is bigger than us now. We have to expose this, no matter the cost." I agreed, though I was sinking deeper into my own waking nightmare. Each night brought a new terror, a vivid replay of events that seemed to be stitched from the very fabric of our lab's past misdeeds. My dreams were filled with faces of patients we'd never met, their expressions twisted in fear. The line between the real and the imagined had vanished. The drug was rewriting reality itself. We decided to leak our findings to the media. It was a desperate gamble, but we had no other options. As we prepared our documentation, I found myself drawn into a disturbing pattern. The more we investigated, the more our own fears manifested. The old project's secret experiments had involved psychological manipulation and memory alteration, practices that were eerily reflected in the drug's effects. The night before our press conference, I was haunted by a final, horrifying vision. It was as if the drug had reached into the darkest corners of my mind, unearthing something that should have remained buried. I saw not only the faces of the old subjects, but also the shadowy figures of the executives who had orchestrated the project. They were in a place of darkness, their eyes gleaming with a cold, indifferent light. At the press conference, the truth spilled out, and the backlash was swift. The company was forced to halt the trials, but the damage was already done. The media frenzy unearthed years of hidden research and unethical practices. Yet, even as the world watched in shock, I couldn't escape the terror that had seeped into my own mind. The nightmares didn't fade. They became more real, more insidious. I began to question what was real and what was a byproduct of the drug's influence. In the end, we had pulled the curtain back on a nightmare, but we couldn't escape it ourselves. The drug's effect was no longer confined to the patients. It had infected our very reality. Michael and I were left to confront the horrifying possibility that the boundaries between our memories, fears, and the drug's influence had shattered beyond repair. The real horror was not in what we had uncovered, but in the unsettling realization that some nightmares never end. They only evolve. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. These words echoed in my mind as I sat in my dimly lit office, staring at the file on my desk. It contained the story of Kara Johnson, a patient whose life was shrouded in the fog of severe dissociative disorders. Her sessions had been filled with fragments of memories and unsettling visions, each one pulling me further into a labyrinth of the mind I had always deemed as a collection of symptoms to be analyzed and resolved. Kara described a house, abandoned and haunting, with mirrors that did more than reflect. They twisted and turned her image into grotesque versions of herself. At first, I attributed her visions to the trauma that had torn through her life. "It's just the mind's way of coping," I had told her, my voice steady, masking my growing unease. "You've experienced things that no one should endure, and your brain is finding ways to protect you." But the doubt simmered beneath the surface. The more I listened, the more I felt the weight of her words. She spoke of the house in vivid detail, as if it were a real place rather than a figment of her fractured psyche. "You don't understand, Dr. Mitchell. When I look in those mirrors, I see things that aren't me. It's like something is trying to get out." Her eyes glistened with fear, and for the first time, I found myself questioning my own understanding of reality. What if there was more to her experience than mere delusions? I buried myself in research, combing through old records and archives of forgotten neighborhoods in New York. The deeper I delved, the more my skepticism wavered. I discovered a place that matched her description, tucked away in an area long ignored by the city. It was eerie how closely the details aligned. Was it possible that Kara's visions weren't just reflections of her trauma, but rather echoes of something real? My rational mind struggled to reconcile this notion. The night before I planned to visit the location, I lay awake, thoughts swirling like the shadows in my room. "You can't be serious," I muttered to myself. "You're a psychologist, not a ghost hunter." But my curiosity had transformed into an insatiable need to confront what lay beneath Kara's words. I had always believed that the mind held the ultimate power over our perceptions. Now, I was on the brink of stepping into a reality that could shatter my beliefs. Arriving at the site the next day felt surreal. The air was thick with an inexplicable tension, as if the world had held its breath. I stood before the house, its windows like vacant eyes staring back at me. The neglected garden had overtaken the entrance, and I hesitated, a chill creeping along my spine. What if Kara's right? What if there's more here than just bricks and mortar? I whispered, the sound swallowed by the wind. My heart raced as I stepped closer, ready to confront whatever truths awaited me within those walls. The old house loomed before me, each step closer, feeling like a descent into uncertainty. The peeling paint and sagging roof were evidence of years forgotten, but it was the eyes of the windows, dark and unblinking, that unsettled me the most. I had come here to debunk the idea that Kara's visions were anything more than a manifestation of her trauma, yet a gnawing doubt tugged at my rational mind. I had always prided myself on my skepticism, but as I approached, that confidence wavered. I fumbled with the lock on the front door, which creaked open reluctantly, revealing a dusty interior that had clearly not seen human presence for years. The air was musty, and each step I took stirred up small clouds of dust that danced in the narrow beams of sunlight filtering through broken windows. The oppressive sense of abandonment was palpable. I spoke aloud, half to comfort myself, half to acknowledge the surrealness of the moment. "This is just a house, nothing more." I moved through the rooms methodically, documenting everything with my phone. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound sharp in the stillness. The mirrors Kara had described were scattered throughout, each one framed in ornate designs that seemed out of place. They were covered in a thick layer of grime, their reflective surfaces warped and obscured. I could almost hear Kara's voice in my head, describing how these mirrors distorted her reflection. "They twist everything," she had said. "Nothing looks like it should." In one particularly large room, I noticed a mirror that stood out. Its frame was intricately carved, depicting scenes of people in distress. As I approached, my reflection seemed to ripple, distorting as if reacting to an unseen force. I felt a strange pull, like the mirror was drawing me in. "This is absurd," I told myself, fighting the creeping sense of unease. I tapped the mirror lightly, hoping to dispel the weird sensations. The glass remained stubbornly opaque. Searching further, I discovered an old diary tucked behind a rotting cabinet. The handwriting inside was erratic, filled with cryptic entries that spoke of experiments and hidden truths. "The house sees you," one entry read. "It knows what you fear." The pages were brittle, and as I flipped through them, a wave of apprehension washed over me. The more I read, the more the diary's descriptions mirrored Kara's accounts. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Just a coincidence," I murmured, though the words felt hollow. As I prepared to leave, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and I could no longer deny the unsettling feeling that had taken hold. I glanced back at the mirrors, their surfaces catching the light in strange ways, casting fragmented reflections that seemed to move independently of my own. I left the house with more questions than answers, my skepticism strained. The rational explanations I had relied upon seemed inadequate now. Kara's visions might be more than just symptoms of her mental state. They might be tied to something beyond my understanding. I hadn't planned on returning to the house so soon, but my curiosity and unease pushed me back through the front door. The diary had left too many unsettling questions unanswered, and my rational mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. My visit had done nothing to reassure me. If anything, it had amplified my concerns. This time, I was more deliberate in my search. I took careful notes and documented everything with my camera, hoping to piece together a clearer picture. As I walked through the musty hallways, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every shadow seemed to flicker, and the mirrors, now more clearly visible, appeared almost to follow my movements. I found myself avoiding their gaze, though I knew I had to confront whatever lay behind them. In the attic, I discovered a small chest buried under a layer of dust. Inside, there were old photographs and papers, some of which seemed to be related to the previous owner's research. The photos were disturbing, images of people with their faces obscured or distorted, their eyes wide with fear. I picked up one photo showing a group of people standing in front of a mirror, their expressions frozen in a strange mix of terror and fascination. Who were these people? I wondered aloud, feeling an odd chill. The faces in the photos seemed familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I could almost hear Kara's voice again, describing her own reflections as twisted and foreign. My logical mind tried to dismiss it, but the evidence was piling up. The documents included sketches and notes about psychological experiments, some involving mirrors and altered states of consciousness. The findings were vague and ominous, suggesting that the experiments had unintended effects. One line stood out: "The mirror distorts not just the image, but the very soul." I couldn't help but shiver. Was this all just coincidence, or was there a deeper, more disturbing truth? As I examined the materials, a strange noise echoed through the attic, like a whisper carried on the wind. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. The noise continued intermittently, a faint but persistent rustling. I felt a growing dread, realizing that my presence might be disturbing something that was best left undisturbed. I left the house feeling more unsettled than before. My rational mind was battling with the tangible fear that something beyond my understanding was at play. The connection between Kara's nightmares and the house was becoming too significant to ignore. The evidence was mounting, but so were my doubts. Was I chasing shadows, or was there a hidden truth I was yet to uncover? Either way, I knew one thing: I needed to dig deeper, no matter how unsettling it became. I returned to Kara's apartment the next morning, determined to share my findings and confront her about what I had uncovered. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels dense and expectant. I knocked on her door, and after a moment, she opened it. Her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept at all. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you find something?" "Yes, I did," I replied, stepping inside. "I've been to the house. I found documents, old photographs, things that suggest your visions might be tied to real events." Her face turned pale. "I've been trying to tell you," she said, her hands trembling. "Every night the house changes. It's not just a reflection, it feels alive." We sat in her small living room, the tension palpable. I showed her the photos and notes I'd discovered. Her reaction was a mix of fear and recognition. "I've seen those faces," Kara said, pointing to a photograph of people in front of a mirror. "In my dreams, they look like the people from my nightmares." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had hoped to debunk her claims, to show her that her experiences were nothing more than a product of her trauma. Instead, the evidence was piling up in a way I couldn't ignore. "Kara, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the house," I said. "Every detail could be important." She hesitated, but then began recounting her dreams in more detail. She described the house's layout, the way the mirrors distorted her reflection, and how she felt a presence watching her. Her voice was shaky, but there was a conviction in her eyes. "There's a room," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's different from the others. It feels darker. I never go in there." My mind raced. The description matched an area of the house I hadn't explored thoroughly. I wondered what lay beyond that door, what secrets it might hold. As I left her apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that would challenge everything I believed about reality and the human mind. The skepticism that had defined my career was now being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. The house was no longer just a place I was investigating. It was becoming a symbol of the unknown, a puzzle that seemed to taunt me with its complexity. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I understood about the human psyche and the limits of scientific explanation. Kara's experiences were becoming a mirror reflecting my own fears and doubts. I knew I had to return to the house and confront whatever was hidden in that dark room. If I didn't, I might never be able to reconcile the fractured pieces of this unsettling puzzle. Returning to the house felt like walking into a storm I couldn't control. My rational mind was battling against an overwhelming sense of dread. Each step I took toward the abandoned structure seemed to echo louder in my head. The chill in the air wasn't just the dropping temperature, it was a palpable tension, as if the house itself was waiting for something. I approached the front door with a mixture of determination and fear. The hinges groaned when I pushed it open, revealing the same dimly lit hallway. I made my way past the rooms I had already explored, heading straight for the door Kara had described, the one she had always avoided. The hallway felt unnervingly longer this time, each step dragging on with increasing weight. When I finally reached the door, I paused, my heart racing. The handle was cold and heavy in my hand, and as I turned it, the door creaked open to reveal a room that was different from the rest. The air felt thicker, almost resistant, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Mirrors covered every inch of the walls, their surfaces cracked and tarnished. The reflections were distorted, creating a maze of broken images. I moved cautiously, trying to make sense of the chaotic reflections that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. My own face appeared to fragment and reassemble in unsettling ways. Then I saw it, a mirror in the far corner, untouched and pristine compared to the others. As I approached, I noticed something odd. My reflection in this mirror was different. My movements were slightly out of sync, and my reflection seemed to be watching me with a sense of knowing that I didn't understand. I reached out to touch the mirror, and a sudden, sharp pain shot through my hand. I yanked it back, my pulse quickening. I realized that the pain was not physical but emotional, a jarring reminder that I was intruding on something far beyond my comprehension. Just then, the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in, and the mirrors began to reflect scenes from my own life, twisted and exaggerated. Memories I had long buried resurfaced, distorting my sense of reality. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more I felt myself losing grip on my rationality. In the midst of the chaos, I saw a figure in one of the reflections, Kara, her eyes filled with an eerie intensity. "You're part of it now," her image said, though her lips didn't move. "You see what we see." That's when it hit me. The house wasn't just affecting Kara, it was drawing me into its web. The psychological experiments and the theoretical constructs I had relied on to understand the human mind were crumbling. I was standing at the edge of a reality that defied explanation, forced to confront a truth I had spent my career denying. I stumbled out of the room, my mind racing. As I left the house, I realized that my investigation had transformed into something deeply personal. I wasn't just helping Kara anymore. I was entangled in a mystery that challenged everything I believed about the nature of reality. The house, with its fractured mirrors, had shown me a reflection of my own fears, one that I wasn't sure I could escape from. The question now wasn't just whether Kara could find peace, but whether I could reclaim my own sanity. The mind is a fragile thing, easily damaged, and not always repairable. John E. Sarno. Starting a new job is never easy, but taking over the management of a disused psychiatric asylum seemed like a particularly grim way to begin. My name is Dr. Samantha Evans. I'm a psychiatrist, and I've spent most of my career challenging boundaries and testing the limits of what we know about the human mind. When I accepted the position at Oakwood Asylum, I was drawn by the potential to study how the building's unique architecture could impact mental health treatment. I didn't anticipate the depth of challenge awaiting me. The asylum is a monument to decay. Its towering structure looms in the distance, and as I approached, the feeling of abandonment was palpable. The hallways are narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper and broken light fixtures. Every step I take seems to echo louder than the last. The air is damp, and the musty scent of mildew is overpowering. I can't help but wonder how many stories these walls could tell, though I suspect they would be tales better left untold. I met Lincoln David during my first day. He's one of the few patients remaining here. His condition is severe, his demeanor unsettling. He talked to me about shadows, about how they're not just shadows, but entities that feed on human madness. At first, I dismissed his claims as typical symptoms of severe schizophrenia. I've heard countless delusions before, and I expected nothing less here. But Lincoln's eyes were different. There was something in them that made me pause, a glimmer of truth or perhaps madness, so profound it was hard to distinguish. As I began my rounds, I tried to focus on my research, but strange things began to happen. Lights flickered unpredictably, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Occasionally, I'd see movement from the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. I told myself it was just the result of old wiring and shadows playing tricks. Yet, the more time I spent in Oakwood, the more these occurrences felt deliberate, as if the asylum itself was trying to communicate something to me. The patients, including Lincoln, seemed affected by the building's atmosphere. Their symptoms fluctuated with the environment, their fears manifesting in ways I hadn't seen before. One evening, while reviewing old patient records, I found references to Dr. Elijah Blackwood, a psychiatrist who once worked here. His experiments, described in fragmented notes, were bizarre and unsettling, attempts to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The mention of occult practices made my skin crawl. It seemed like the asylum held secrets far darker than I had imagined. Every day at Oakwood feels like walking a tightrope between skepticism and fear. I keep rationalizing the strange occurrences, but each day, my grip on logic weakens. The building is alive with something I can't yet define, something that seems to have a dark purpose. I'm left questioning everything I thought I knew about the human mind and the nature of reality. The asylum's history and the enigmatic presence of its shadows are drawing me into a web of psychological and supernatural intrigue, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm on the edge of something profoundly unsettling. I'm now more determined than ever to unravel the truth behind Oakwood Asylum. I need to understand if there's any scientific basis for Lincoln's claims or if my own sanity is being tested. As I dive deeper into the asylum's secrets, I am forced to confront not only the history of this place, but also my own fears and limitations. What I uncover might challenge the very foundations of my understanding of reality. The more time I spent at Oakwood Asylum, the more uneasy I became. The building's oppressive atmosphere seemed to seep into everything. Every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the lights seemed to taunt my skepticism, nudging me closer to the edge of disbelief. I tried to remind myself of my purpose here, examining the impact of architecture on mental health. But something about the place made that focus increasingly difficult. I had another session with Lincoln David, who seemed more agitated than usual. His claims about the shadows had started to sound less like delusions and more like warnings. "The shadows," he said, "they don't want you here. They feed on our fears, our despair. They're waiting." His eyes were wide, haunted. I tried to maintain my professional demeanor, but his words lingered in my mind long after our session ended. Later, I reviewed more of Dr. Elijah Blackwood's notes. The deeper I went, the more unsettling they became. Blackwood's experiments were not just about mental health. They aimed to blur the lines between the living and the dead. He described rituals, diagrams, and symbols I didn't understand. Each page I turned felt like it was pulling me further into a labyrinth of dread. Was it possible that Blackwood's experiments had left something behind? That night, I wandered the asylum's empty halls, driven by a mix of curiosity and a nagging sense of being watched. The flickering lights cast long, distorted shadows that twisted into grotesque shapes. I felt a presence that I couldn't quite place, a sense that something was following me, even when I turned around and saw nothing. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, making the air feel charged, almost electric. I met with a few of the staff, hoping to gain insights or reassurance. Instead, I found them as unsettled as I was. One nurse mentioned, almost in a whisper, that some patients spoke of hearing voices at night, seeing things that weren't there. "It's been happening for years," she said. "You'd think the place would be abandoned forever." Her words, though meant to comfort, only added to my growing sense of dread. As days passed, I began to question my own perceptions. The asylum's oppressive architecture seemed designed to unsettle and distort. The more I tried to rationalize the inexplicable occurrences, the more I felt my grip on reality slipping. Every corner of the building seemed to hide secrets, every shadow a potential threat. My research into Blackwood's methods was becoming more than just academic. It was as if I was being drawn into a deeper, more sinister reality. The asylum wasn't just a backdrop. It was becoming an active participant in the psychological drama unfolding within its walls. I'm increasingly torn between dismissing my experiences as stress-induced hallucinations and acknowledging that there might be something profoundly wrong with Oakwood. Whatever is happening here is pushing me to confront my deepest fears, and I have to decide whether to continue exploring the asylum's dark history or to leave before I lose my grip on my own sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong with Oakwood Asylum. Each visit left me more unsettled, my skepticism wearing thin. My interactions with Lincoln were increasingly disturbing. He spoke of shadows with a conviction that I found hard to ignore, despite my professional training. His words replayed in my mind like a broken record, pulling me into his world of paranoia. One afternoon, I was exploring the asylum's records room, a place that seemed untouched for decades. The dusty files were filled with patient histories and experimental notes, but one folder stood out. It detailed the rituals performed by Dr. Elijah Blackwood. The language was cryptic, filled with symbols and terms that made my skin crawl. Descriptions of opening portals and bridging worlds were written in a scrawl that seemed almost frantic. I couldn't dismiss them as mere madness. They felt too calculated, too deliberate. That evening, I decided to investigate the parts of the asylum that were off-limits to staff. The further I ventured, the more the building seemed to close in on me. Every hallway twisted in a way that defied logic, and every door led to a different corridor. It was as if the asylum itself was shifting, adapting to my presence. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the sense that I was being observed by unseen eyes. In a particularly dark corner of the asylum, I discovered an old therapy room. The equipment was rusted, and the chairs were covered in grime, but it was the mirrors on the walls that caught my attention. They were shattered, the pieces reflecting fragmented images of myself. The sight was disorienting, as if the mirrors were showing me different versions of reality. I stood there, staring at my distorted reflection, feeling as if the room was closing in around me. I returned to my office, feeling more confused than ever. Lincoln had mentioned something about the mirrors in his delusions. Could there be a connection between his fears and the asylum's architecture? I reviewed his files again, trying to piece together any link. His accounts of shadows and distorted reflections seemed eerily similar to the unsettling feeling I experienced in the therapy room. My colleagues noticed my growing unease, and I could sense their growing concern. They asked about my late hours and frequent absences. I tried to assure them that it was just the nature of the work, but I could tell they were worried. I, too, was beginning to question my own sanity. The asylum's grip on me felt tighter with each passing day. The line between rational thought and irrational fear was blurring, and I feared that I was teetering on the edge of something I could no longer control. With each step, I was drawn further into the asylum's mysteries. Every discovery seemed to confirm Lincoln's fears rather than disprove them. The shadows were becoming more than just a figment of his imagination. I needed to uncover the truth behind the asylum and Blackwood's experiments before the lines between reality and delusion vanished completely. I had spent days sifting through the asylum's old documents and had barely scratched the surface. Each file seemed to deepen the mystery, but also heighten my own sense of dread. One night, while reviewing notes in the abandoned records room, I stumbled upon an old journal. The cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded. Inside, Dr. Blackwood's handwriting was barely legible, but one passage stood out. The boundary between our world and theirs is thin, and the shadows seek to cross it. My curiosity led me to explore the building further. It was late, and the staff had long gone home, leaving me alone in the asylum. The sense of isolation was oppressive, and the air felt dense as I walked through the dimly lit hallways. My footsteps echoed strangely, and the shadows on the walls seemed to flicker with a life of their own. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond my line of sight. In one of the upper floors, I discovered a hidden door behind a large, dusty tapestry. The door was small and unassuming, but the handle felt cold as I turned it. Inside was a room filled with strange apparatuses and old, tattered documents. The room had an unsettling quality, as if it had been frozen in time. On a table in the center, there were several old journals and strange symbols drawn on the walls. I couldn't decipher them, but they looked disturbingly similar to the ones in Blackwood's notes. As I examined the symbols, a cold draft swept through the room. I glanced up and saw one of the mirrors begin to tremble slightly. The surface warped and twisted, reflecting an image that was not quite right, an image of myself, but distorted and blurred. It was as if the mirror was trying to show me something beyond my own reflection. I felt a shiver run through me, and the room seemed to close in. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, but the sound of my own desperation echoed back at me. I fumbled with the lock, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the room felt charged, as if something was building up, preparing for something I couldn't understand. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally creaked open. I rushed out, my heart racing, and I nearly collided with Lincoln, who had somehow found his way to that part of the asylum. His eyes were wild, and he clutched a piece of paper in his hand. "Dr. Evans," he said, his voice trembling. "They're coming. The shadows, they're coming for us." I was too shaken to respond. Lincoln's fear mirrored my own, and I couldn't ignore the truth in his eyes. The asylum was more than just an abandoned building. It was a gateway to something much darker. I needed to understand what had been unleashed here before it consumed everything. My skepticism was crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of terror that I couldn't ignore. I had to uncover the secrets of Oakwood Asylum, no matter the cost. The asylum's walls seemed to close in as I struggled to grasp the magnitude of what I had uncovered. Lincoln's fear had ignited something in me, an understanding that went beyond rationality. I knew I had to confront the source of this terror, even though every instinct urged me to run. Late that night, I returned to the records room, feeling as if the shadows themselves guided my steps. My breath was shallow, and my hands trembled as I flipped through Dr. Blackwood's journals. The eerie passage about the boundary between worlds haunted me. I had to know what had driven him to such madness. The journals revealed disturbing experiments involving rituals meant to blur the lines between life and death. Blackwood's notes described how he believed he could control the entities he called the shadows by creating a thin veil between worlds. The deeper I read, the more I realized that Blackwood's failure wasn't just theoretical. It was something that had left a lasting mark on this place. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping noise from behind me. I turned, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and lengthen, as if they were stretching towards me. I felt my heart pound as the temperature dropped and the room grew colder. I stared at the mirror, which now showed not just my reflection, but a distorted version of the room, as if reality itself was warping. As I approached the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, Lincoln's voice cut through the tension. "You have to stop this," he said, appearing in the doorway, his face pale. "The shadows are becoming stronger. They're feeding on our fear." I turned to face him, my mind racing. "What do you mean, Lincoln? How do we stop this?" He took a deep breath. "The experiments, Blackwood's rituals, they created a bond. We have to find the core of the problem, where the veil is weakest. There's a room in the basement he never mentioned in his notes. That's where the real work was done." Fear and determination battled within me. I followed Lincoln to the basement, every step echoing ominously. As we descended, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in tighter. We finally reached a heavy, rusted door. Lincoln hesitated but pushed it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit chamber, with symbols etched into the floor and walls. In the center of the room lay a large, blackened book, its cover marked with the same symbols I had seen in Blackwood's notes. As I picked it up, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, plunging us into darkness. I felt an overwhelming presence, as if the room itself was alive and angry. The book fell open to a page describing a final ritual, one meant to seal the boundary between worlds, but requiring a sacrifice. The realization hit me with a cold wave. The ritual wasn't just a theory, it was a way to bind the shadows permanently, but it demanded a personal cost. Lincoln's voice trembled beside me. "We have to complete the ritual, or the shadows will never leave." Panic gripped me. "What if it's too late?" "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. We began the ritual, following the instructions as best as we could in the dark. As we completed the final incantation, a deafening silence fell. The shadows in the room writhed and twisted violently before finally retreating, as if pushed back by an unseen force. Exhausted and shaken, we left the basement, the shadows seemingly receding with each step. But as I glanced back at the asylum, I knew this wasn't over. The shadows had been driven away, but their mark on us was indelible. The asylum's history had revealed its dark truth, and I was left with a profound fear that the veil between worlds might never be fully restored. The terror I felt now was not just of what lurked in the asylum, but of the unseen boundaries we may have inadvertently unleashed. Every man has his secret sorrows which the world knows not, and oftentimes we call a man cold when he is only sad. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Dr. Chloe Carter here. I've always believed that understanding the mind is a matter of peeling back layers, much like an onion. Each layer reveals more of the person beneath, until eventually you uncover their core. That's why I agreed to take on Lucas Reed as a patient. His case was intriguing. Diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, he had been found wandering Charleston in a state of confusion. His erratic behavior had turned him into a local enigma. Lucas walked into my office with the kind of wary eyes that seemed to be perpetually on guard. He avoided direct eye contact, his demeanor cautious. It took weeks of therapy before he began to open up, and even then, it felt like I was conversing with different people rather than a single individual. Each personality he presented had its own quirks and idiosyncrasies. One was a solemn, almost priestly figure, while another was a cynical and mocking presence. It was as if Lucas was a stage and each personality was a different character in a play. The deeper I delved into Lucas's psyche, the more I noticed unsettling patterns. One personality in particular seemed to possess knowledge that was both specific and deeply invasive. It knew about my life in ways that felt almost too precise, details about my routines, my family, and even my most private fears. I tried to dismiss it as a symptom of his disorder, but the creeping unease wouldn't leave me. Then the messages began. Anonymous notes appeared on my desk, each one more disturbing than the last. They described scenes from my own life, weaving in my deepest fears with an accuracy that felt too precise to be mere coincidence. Each note seemed to reflect the content of our sessions, casting a chilling shadow over my day-to-day existence. I remember one that read, "Your family will soon understand what it's like to be helpless." I started investigating the source of these messages. My colleagues, friends, and even a private investigator couldn't find any leads. The sense of paranoia was growing stronger with each passing day. Lucas's sessions became more intense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that one of his personalities was orchestrating these threats. But how could this be? And why was I, a trained psychologist, unable to make sense of the situation? It wasn't until a late evening in my office, with shadows creeping across the walls, that I stumbled onto something horrifying. As I reviewed Lucas's therapy notes, a pattern began to emerge, connecting his different personalities to specific details of the threats I had received. Lucas wasn't just a patient, he was orchestrating a psychological game that left me questioning my own sanity. Each revelation pushed me further into a nightmare where trust became a fragile illusion. I realized then that the true horror wasn't just Lucas's disorder, it was the malevolent mind behind it, which seemed to be manipulating events from the dark corners of his fractured psyche. I've set the stage for the unraveling terror that Chloe will face. Does this align with your vision? When Lucas Reed walked into my office for the second time, he seemed even more fragmented. It's hard to explain, but each time he entered, it felt like he was bringing a different person with him. I could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a kind of subtle tension that made the air feel dense, though nothing physically changed. He took his usual seat across from me, his eyes darting around the room as if he were scanning for something or someone. "You seem uneasy," I remarked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Lucas's voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's not the room that bothers me." He looked down at his hands, which trembled slightly. "It's the things I see, shadows that shouldn't be there." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but I also noticed the peculiarities in his story. His descriptions of the shadows were vague, yet they hinted at a deeper fear. "What kind of shadows?" I asked, pressing gently. He shifted in his seat, his gaze growing distant. "The kind that move when they shouldn't. They're always there, lurking. Sometimes I hear whispers, but when I turn around, there's nothing." I tried to reason with him, attributing his fears to his condition. "Lucas, shadows and whispers can often be products of the mind, especially under stress. Have you considered that these might be manifestations of your internal conflicts?" He shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's not just in my mind. There's something else, something real." The conversation left me unsettled. I tried to focus on his progress, but each session felt increasingly disjointed. Lucas's personalities seemed to overlap in strange ways, each one offering new, unsettling insights into his condition. One personality would be introspective, another would be wildly paranoid, and yet another would act like a detached observer. It was as if each persona was a different lens through which he viewed the world, and through which I was forced to view him. Then came the messages. They began as sporadic notes left on my desk, always signed anonymously. The first one was innocuous enough, simply reading, "Careful, Chloe." But as days passed, they grew more personal, more disturbing. Descriptions of my daily routine, details about my family, things I had never shared in our sessions. The last note I received had my name scrawled in a way that felt like a personal threat. "Your world will unravel soon." The notes threw me into a spiral of paranoia. I had to check and recheck the locks on my office door and the windows of my home. I even started changing my daily routine to avoid any predictable patterns. But the creeping fear was inescapable. Lucas's sessions became a battleground where my professional demeanor clashed with an increasing sense of dread. I decided to investigate the source of these notes, hoping to find a rational explanation. Each lead I followed, every attempt to trace the sender, only seemed to lead me in circles. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Lucas's personalities were not merely symptoms, but active participants in a disturbing game. I began to fear that he was using our sessions to manipulate and control, his fractured psyche orchestrating a web of psychological terror that I was struggling to comprehend. Every moment in my office felt like walking through a fog of impending doom. Lucas's demeanor shifted with each visit, and the messages continued, weaving into my life in ways I couldn't ignore. The more I learned, the more I wondered, was I merely a pawn in his game, or was there something far more sinister at play? The messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. One morning, I found a new note tucked inside a file on my desk. The paper was crumpled, as if it had been hastily discarded. The message read, "You're not as observant as you think. Watch closely." Lucas's behavior in our sessions grew increasingly erratic. One day, he arrived with a cold detachment that was unlike anything I had seen before. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward with an intensity that made me uneasy, "about the way you handle me. You're trying to uncover something, aren't you?" I was caught off guard. "Lucas, my goal is to help you understand and manage your condition. There's no hidden agenda here." He chuckled softly, but it lacked warmth. "You're not fooling me. I know you're digging deeper, but be careful. Some things are better left alone." His cryptic comments only added to my unease. I tried to maintain professionalism, but his words haunted me. The more I engaged with him, the more I felt like I was unraveling a puzzle that might not have a solution. Then the messages started to describe my personal life in chilling detail. "I saw you at the park yesterday. It's a nice place to spend time with your daughter." The notes mentioned specific incidents, like my lunch with a colleague or the time I had been stuck in traffic. It was as though someone was following me, closely observing my every move. One evening, as I reviewed the latest note in my office, I heard a soft knock on the door. I opened it to find Lucas standing there, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I need to show you something," he said. His voice was trembling, but his gaze was fixed on mine with an unsettling seriousness. I followed him to his car, parked a few blocks away. Inside, he revealed a small, worn notebook. The pages were filled with scrawled notes and drawings that seemed to capture fragments of his different personas. "These are the things I see," Lucas said. "They're not just in my head, they're real." The notebook contained detailed drawings of shadows and shapes that matched descriptions from his previous sessions. One drawing depicted a dark figure that seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. My anxiety spiked as I realized that his claims might be more than mere delusions. Lucas's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. One day during a session, he abruptly stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the cityscape. "Do you ever feel like someone's watching you?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. "Because I do, and it's not just me." I tried to reassure him, but my own fears were mounting. The lines between his reality and mine were blurring, making me question everything I thought I knew about him and myself. I felt trapped in a psychological maze with no clear exit, and every turn seemed to lead deeper into darkness. The stakes were rising. My professional confidence was eroding, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Lucas seemed to be orchestrating a complex game, using his multiple personalities to manipulate me and the situation. As I tried to piece together the clues, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into a trap, one where the boundaries of sanity and reality were dangerously intertwined. I needed to act quickly. The latest note was left in a place only I would know about, a hidden compartment in my desk drawer. It described details of a family outing, a recent picnic with my daughter. Whoever was behind this had been watching me closely. I tried to rationalize it, but the creeping unease was undeniable. Lucas's sessions were becoming increasingly erratic. One day, he arrived at my office wearing a dark, unkempt coat. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with frantic energy. "I've been thinking about our conversations," he said, pacing back and forth. "The more I talk, the more I realize that you're not just treating me, you're part of something bigger, something I can't control." "Lucas, "We're here to address your concerns and manage your symptoms," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's focus on what's troubling you." He stopped abruptly and faced me. "No, you don't understand. You're caught in a web I didn't weave. You think you're in control, but you're not. You're being watched, just like I am." His paranoia was intensifying, and I couldn't ignore the implications. Was someone else manipulating this situation, or was Lucas truly unraveling? My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. The notes kept escalating. One described a personal fear, the exact time I'd be alone in my house. I took extra precautions, but the sense of vulnerability persisted. My nights were spent reviewing every detail of the notes, trying to find any clues that would lead me to the sender. My phone was constantly in my hand, checking for any signs of intrusion. Lucas's revelations during therapy grew darker. During one session, he revealed a shocking detail. "There's someone else in my head," he said with a voice that wasn't his own. "They've been telling me things about you. They want me to make you see." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tinged with anxiety. He leaned in close, his eyes wide with an unsettling intensity. "They want you to know that you're part of their plan. They're watching us both. They're controlling everything." I felt the walls of my office close in. Lucas's statements seemed more like threats than mere delusions. His behavior suggested that he was not only aware of my private fears, but was also actively using them against me. My professional confidence began to wane as I faced the realization that I might be entangled in a psychological game designed to manipulate and terrify me. That night, after Lucas's session, I found another note on my doorstep. It was simple: "Look deeper." As I read the words, a sinking feeling settled in. I had thought that understanding Lucas's condition was my way out, but it now felt like a trap. The lines between my work and my personal life were blurring, and I was left to confront a reality where my safety and sanity were at stake. The tension had reached its peak. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was manipulating me, but I couldn't grasp how or why. The notes, the unsettling conversations, everything was weaving into a disturbing pattern I couldn't ignore. I felt like I was trapped in a psychological labyrinth with no clear path out. During one of our sessions, Lucas's demeanor shifted again. He spoke with a calm that felt almost too controlled. "Chloe, you've been a great therapist, but I'm afraid this is where our journey ends." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to mask my growing dread. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something cold and calculating behind them. "You see, I've been trying to help you understand something. You're part of this, Chloe. You're part of the plan." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The message was clear. He was in control, and I was merely a pawn in his game. Every fear I had, every private detail of my life that had been exposed, was now a tool he used to destabilize me. I felt as though the walls of my office were closing in, suffocating me with the weight of the realization. As I left the session, I saw another note waiting for me in the car. This one was different. It was a drawing, a crude sketch of a person trapped in a cage. Underneath it, the words "You're next" were scrawled. I didn't know whether to feel terror or anger. The notes had become more personal, and the threat seemed imminent. The knowledge that someone was orchestrating this entire nightmare, with me as the target, was terrifying. I decided to confront Lucas, not in therapy, but directly. I went to his apartment, a place that felt more like a dark pit than a living space. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. I moved through the rooms, searching for any sign of him. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, a whisper, almost like a breath. I followed it, heart pounding, until I reached a small, hidden room at the back of the apartment. Inside, I found a wall covered in newspaper clippings, photographs of me, and a detailed map with locations marked. My pulse quickened as I realized the extent of Lucas's obsession. It wasn't just therapy. He had been following me, studying me. The worst part was the journal lying on a table, filled with detailed notes about my personal life and sessions. The final entry was chilling. "The final move is yours to make, Chloe." I stumbled out of the apartment, struggling to process the revelation. Lucas wasn't just a patient with a complex disorder. He was orchestrating a horrifying psychological experiment, using me as the central figure. The realization hit me with full force. My life was a part of his twisted game. In psychology, we often talk about the concept of locus of control, the degree to which people believe they have control over their lives. I had thought I was in control of my own therapy, my own life. But now it was clear that someone else had been pulling the strings all along. When I first met Cole, I didn't think much of it. Just another kid with a troubled mind. I had seen it before. Children retreating into imaginary worlds to escape something they couldn't explain. He was small for his age, pale, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his 8 years. His mother sat beside him, tense, hands clasped in her lap. She spoke more than he did, her voice trembling slightly as she described how Cole had stopped interacting with other kids, how he would stay up late into the night, scared of what he said he could see. At first, I thought it was textbook trauma, maybe bullying or something worse. Kids like Cole often created monsters in their heads to make sense of the things they couldn't understand. But it was when he finally spoke that something in me shifted. "I see people who aren't alive," he said softly, almost like he didn't want to hear the words himself. My immediate reaction was to rationalize it. Hallucinations, an overactive imagination, perhaps triggered by some unresolved grief. Yet, there was a sincerity in his tone that gnawed at me. Kids lie to protect themselves, but there was no deception in Cole's eyes, just fear. I assured him and his mother that we'd work through it, told them we'd take it one step at a time. But as they left my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be like the others. I remembered Vincent Gray. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Years ago, I had a patient just like Cole, frightened, lost in his own mind. But Vincent's story had ended tragically. I hadn't been able to save him. He had broken into my home one night, distraught, screaming that he was haunted by things no one else could see, and I had written it off as delusion. Hours later, he was dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of Vincent's face, his eyes wide with terror, begging me to believe him. I had failed him. And now here was Cole, a boy with the same hollow expression, pleading for someone to understand. I convinced myself that this time it would be different. I had learned. I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I'd approach Cole with a fresh perspective, not let my guilt from Vincent cloud my judgment. But deep down, I wondered if it was too late, if I was too late again. The next session with Cole felt heavier. I asked him to tell me more about the people he saw. His voice barely a whisper. He described men and women, sometimes children, who appeared out of nowhere. They didn't speak to him, but they were there, always watching. "They don't know they're dead," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. That line stuck with me, the casual certainty of it. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He was just stating a fact, like it was the most normal thing in the world. After that session, I started questioning everything. Had I misdiagnosed Vincent? Could there be something more to what these children were experiencing? No, I told myself. There's always a rational explanation. But every time I saw Cole, the line between what was real and what wasn't became harder to define. Each time he described another encounter, a part of me began to doubt my own understanding of the world. After that second session, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, not just with Cole, but with me. I found myself thinking about him more than I should. On my drive home while I made dinner, even when I was supposed to be relaxing, Cole's voice lingered in my head. "They don't know they're dead." The words looped in my mind like a song you can't forget. I tried to tell myself it was just a symptom of his condition, that I'd seen this before in other patients, but it felt different this time. One evening, I sat at my desk, reviewing notes from his case, and I realized I was holding my breath. I hadn't done that in years. The last time was with Vincent. Something about that unsettled me deeply, like a cold reminder of my past failures. I told myself I wouldn't let it get to that point again, but here I was, lost in the same doubt and guilt that had once driven me to near burnout. My wife, Anna, noticed. She always noticed. "You seem distant," she said while we were having dinner. Her eyes were soft but concerned, and I knew she was seeing the cracks. "Is it another tough case?" I hesitated. "Yeah, something like that." I finally answered, pushing the food around on my plate. I didn't tell her the whole truth because I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that a kid's stories about dead people are starting to mess with your head? I didn't want her to think I was losing it, but a part of me wondered if I was. The next day, I asked Cole if he could draw what he saw. It was a technique I used with some of my younger patients. Sometimes they could express what they couldn't say. Cole hesitated but agreed, taking the paper and pencils I gave him. He worked in silence for what felt like an eternity, his small hand moving carefully, deliberately. When he finally handed it back, I had to suppress the urge to shudder. The drawing was of a man, his face blurred, eyes hollow, standing in a hallway that looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. I asked, as calmly as I could, "Where is this?" Cole looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Your house," he said simply. My heart skipped. "What do you mean, my house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just shrugged, as if it wasn't a big deal. "He told me he's been there before. He's looking for you." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was impossible, just a figment of Cole's imagination. But another part of me, the part that had never really let go of Vincent's case, started to wonder, was it possible? Could this be something more than psychological? I quickly brushed the thought away, but it left a pit in my stomach that refused to fade. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house seemed louder, sharper. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the fridge. I found myself glancing at the hallway, expecting I don't know what. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more than an overactive imagination stirred by Cole's eerie stories. But the unease lingered, crawling under my skin. After that conversation with Cole, I couldn't focus on anything. His words played on a loop in my mind, tainting every moment of my day. The more I thought about it, the more I tried to rationalize it. He's a kid, I told myself. He's making up stories, trying to process something traumatic. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something about the way he spoke, so matter-of-fact, chilled me in a way I hadn't experienced before. It felt too real, too specific. I started avoiding the hallway at night, almost unconsciously. Every time I passed it, I would catch myself glancing toward the far end, expecting to see something or someone waiting. Anna noticed my distraction. "You've been acting strange," she said one evening as we sat in the living room. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were searching, as if she already knew the answer but needed me to say it. "What's going on?" "I'm fine," I replied, but even I didn't believe it. How could I explain that a child's drawing had lodged itself so firmly in my thoughts that it was beginning to distort my reality? I couldn't tell her. I didn't want to admit that I was letting a patient get to me like this. Not again. The next session with Cole was different. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn, as if he was holding something back. I watched him carefully, trying to read the tension in his small frame. "Cole, how have you been feeling since we last talked?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, professional. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the floor, his feet swinging slightly from the chair. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was almost a whisper. "They're still coming," he said. My skin prickled at the words. I leaned forward, trying to keep my calm. "Who's coming, Cole?" He glanced up at me, his eyes wide, and for the first time I saw real fear in them. "The dead people. They're angry because I talked to you." I felt a chill I couldn't shake. "Why are they angry?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He didn't answer, just looked at me like I was supposed to already know. That look, like I was the one missing something obvious, stayed with me long after the session ended. Driving home, I tried to push the conversation out of my mind, but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Anna texting me to pick up something for dinner, but even the everydayness of that couldn't pull me back to reality. As I pulled into the driveway, I sat for a moment, staring at the dark outline of our house. I found myself hesitating before going inside, as if the safety of my own home had been compromised by Cole's words. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to Anna's soft breathing beside me. The house felt different, unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but it was more than that. Something had shifted. I wasn't just scared of what Cole had said. I was scared of what it was doing to me. The days started to blur together, each one a repetition of the last. I found myself consumed by the case of Cole Sear, obsessing over his drawings and statements. It was as if the more I delved into his world, the more it invaded mine. Each night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Anna noticed my increasing preoccupation. "You need to take a break," she said one evening, as we were trying to enjoy a quiet dinner. Her voice was firm but concerned. "You're getting too wrapped up in this case. It's affecting you." I tried to brush it off. "It's just a challenging case, that's all. I'll be fine." But as I looked into her eyes, I saw that she wasn't buying it. "I'll be okay," I repeated, more to convince myself than her. The following day, I decided to visit the old office building where I'd treated Cole's predecessor, a former patient named Daniel. Daniel's case had been one of my most challenging, and the events surrounding his treatment had left scars, both in my career and my personal life. His tragic suicide had been a catalyst for my divorce. I felt compelled to revisit the space, hoping it might provide some clarity or at least a semblance of control. Walking through the now empty halls, I felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. The office where I had treated Daniel was still as I remembered it, though now dust-covered and forlorn. I sat in the old leather chair, trying to reconstruct the sessions we had. Daniel had been a troubled soul, much like Cole, but his distress had manifested in different ways, darker, more destructive. As I sifted through the remnants of my past work, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection between Daniel's case and Cole's, a thread linking their stories in ways I hadn't fully understood. Returning home that night, the shadows in the house seemed more pronounced. Every creak and groan of the floorboards sounded amplified, as if they were trying to convey a message I couldn't grasp. I tried to talk myself down, convincing myself that it was just the stress. But as I climbed into bed, the unease settled in. My mind replayed every detail of Cole's last session, his haunting eyes, his cryptic words. It was then that I noticed something peculiar. On the edge of the nightstand, just barely visible, was a crumpled drawing, one I didn't recognize. It depicted a dark figure with hollow eyes, standing in a shadowy corner. My heart raced as I picked it up, trying to understand. The drawing was unmistakably like the ones Cole had made, but this one wasn't supposed to be in my house. I glanced around the room, feeling a surge of panic. Had someone been here? Or was I slipping into paranoia, seeing threats where there were none? I looked at the drawing again, feeling an oppressive weight in my chest. I couldn't explain how it got there, or why it seemed so familiar. I felt as though the walls were closing in on a truth I wasn't prepared to face. The drawing lay there like a dark omen, a reminder that Cole's case was pulling me into a deeper abyss than I had ever imagined. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I knew I was no longer just a psychologist treating a troubled child. I was in the midst of something far darker, and there was no turning back. The tension kept building, and I was becoming more convinced that I was missing something crucial about Cole's condition. The drawings, the whispers in the back of my mind, everything seemed to be converging into a singular, unnerving revelation. I started to question my own sanity. Was I becoming so absorbed in the case that I was losing my grip on reality? During a session with Cole, I decided to address the drawings directly. "Cole," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've seen some new pictures you've drawn. Can you tell me about this one?" I handed him the crumpled drawing I'd found. His face went pale, and his eyes widened with something like fear. Or was it recognition? He hesitated before speaking. "That's the man in the corner. He's always watching." His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking any louder might invite the figure from the drawing into the room. I could feel a chill running down my spine. I pressed on, trying to get more information, but his responses were vague, filled with dread. That evening, I reviewed the case notes and old files again. I was determined to find a connection between Cole and Daniel. It was then that I stumbled upon something disturbing. A name in my old case files, a name I had not connected to Daniel's case before, David Collins. He had been a patient before Daniel, and his case had been marked with similar disturbing patterns, including drawings and paranoia about being watched. David Collins had committed suicide in his apartment, leaving behind a note that was almost a mirror image of Cole's recent statements. The realization hit me hard. Each patient seemed to follow a pattern, their experiences culminating in an ominous sense of being observed by an unseen presence. I felt a sinking dread that perhaps I was on the brink of uncovering a pattern that had dire implications. The next day, I decided to confront Cole's mother about any new developments. "Has Cole mentioned anything unusual at home? Any changes in behavior or comments that stood out?" I asked her. Her face was troubled, and she nodded slowly. "He's been talking about the man in the corner more frequently," she admitted. "He says he sees him at night, and he's scared to sleep alone." Her voice cracked, revealing her own anxiety about Cole's condition. "And he keeps talking about the dark man from his drawings. I thought it was just his imagination." That evening, as I reviewed the case files again, something caught my eye. A set of old recordings from David Collins's therapy sessions. I played them back, hoping to find some insight. One particular recording struck me. David had talked about a shadowy figure he saw in his home, a figure he described almost identically to Cole's man in the corner. A sudden realization hit me. Was this shadowy presence somehow connected to the psychological breakdowns of my patients? As I turned off the recording and sat in the dimly lit room, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Was I unwittingly facilitating a conduit for something dark and malevolent? My own practice, which was meant to help, might have become a stage for something far more sinister. The next day, Cole's condition worsened, and his descriptions of the shadowy figure became more vivid. He talked about the dark man coming into his room at night, standing silently and watching him. I could no longer ignore the creeping fear that there was more to Cole's case than just a troubled child's imagination. It felt as though I was on the edge of a revelation that could shatter everything I thought I understood about my profession. In a final, desperate attempt to find answers, I decided to revisit Cole's home. As I walked through his dimly lit hallway, I felt an inexplicable coldness, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far darker than I could ever have imagined. The deeper I dug, the more it seemed that the answers I sought were leading me to an inescapable conclusion about my own role in this unfolding nightmare.